Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the moment they can prove everyone wrong. I spent 38 years being invisible in my own family until the day I bought my sister's dream house right out from under her. My name is Erica Fisher, and this is the story of how one dinner changed everything. When my father looked me in the eye and said, "You'll never own a house like Melissa," something inside me shifted. My younger sister laughed. The whole family laughed. They saw exactly what they'd always seen: the forgotten daughter, the disappointment, the one who would never measure up. What they didn't see was the $3.8 million I had sitting in my bank account. See, my family had no idea who I really was. While they dismissed me as a failure, I had quietly become a self-made millionaire. While they planned my sister's future in a mansion she couldn't afford, I was already signing the papers to buy it in cash. But this story isn't just about a house. It's about 22 years of lies, hidden inheritance, a father drowning in gambling debts, and 3 women finally standing up to the man who controlled them all. What happens when the family that humiliated you discovers you own the mansion they thought belonged to your sister? What happens when your father tries to sue you for an inheritance that was always yours? And what happens when you uncover the devastating truth about how your mother really died? Stay with me until the end, because what started as petty family drama becomes a courtroom battle that will expose secrets no one saw coming and deliver justice so satisfying you'll feel it in your bones. This is my story. And trust me, you won't believe how it ends. My name is Erica Fisher. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 15 years I've built a successful career in software development in the city, quietly, carefully, and completely under my family's radar. I learned a long time ago that sometimes the best way to protect yourself is to become invisible to the people who hurt you most. Tonight, driving back to my childhood hometown for what I thought would be just another forgettable family dinner, I had no idea that invisibility was about to become my greatest weapon. The dining room looked exactly as I remembered it, the same mahogany table my mother picked out 22 years ago. The same cream-colored walls. The same crystal chandelier casting warm light over faces that had grown older, but no kinder. My father sat at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture radiating the authority he'd wielded over this household for as long as I could remember. My stepmother Linda sat to his right, her smile pleasant and practiced. And then there was Melissa, my 32-year-old stepsister, occupying the seat of honor to my father's left, her designer dress catching the light every time she moved. The table was crowded with extended family aunts, uncles, cousins who had driven in from neighboring towns. Everyone seemed cheerful, glasses of wine, half-empty plates filled with the roasted chicken and garlic potatoes that Linda had spent all afternoon preparing. I sat near the far end of the table, the same position I'd occupied at family gatherings for years, close enough to be present, but far enough to be forgotten. Dinner conversation flowed easily around me. Melissa talked animatedly about her new job at a marketing firm, her recent vacation to Cabo, her plans to redecorate her apartment. My father listened with the kind of rapt attention I'd stopped expecting from him years ago. He asked follow-up questions, laughed at her jokes, reached over to pat her hand affectionately. I picked at my food and smiled politely when anyone glanced my way, which wasn't often. Then, somewhere between dessert and coffee, my father stood up. He clinked his wine glass with his fork, calling for everyone's attention. The chatter died down, and all eyes turned toward him. "I want to make an announcement," he said, his voice warm and proud. "As you all know, Melissa has been working incredibly hard, and Linda and I couldn't be more proud of her success." He paused, beaming down at my stepsister. "So, we've decided to help her with a down payment on a house. Not just any house, a mansion. $3.8 million. The room erupted in congratulations. Relatives gasped and applauded. Melissa's face glowed with delight as she stood to hug my father, then Linda. I watched the scene unfold with the same detached feeling I'd learned to cultivate over the years, that protective numbness that kept the pain at arm's length. But my father wasn't finished. He turned and his eyes found mine across the table. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read, pity perhaps, or maybe just casual dismissal. "Erica," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "you should be realistic about your own situation. You'll never have a house like Melissa. It's important to know your limitations and be content with what you can actually achieve." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, waiting for my reaction. Melissa didn't even try to hide her smirk. She actually laughed, a light tinkling sound that felt like glass breaking inside my chest. My Aunt Margaret looked at me with sympathy. Uncle Tom shook his head slightly, as if agreeing with my father's assessment. Cousin Jennifer glanced away, embarrassed on my behalf. The message was clear: they all saw me exactly the way my father did. The forgotten daughter. The one who left for the city and never amounted to much. The disappointment. I could have said something. I could have told them about the software program I developed 3 years ago, the one I sold to a Fortune 500 company for 7 figures. I could have mentioned my investment portfolio, my stock options, the comfortable life I'd built entirely on my own. I could have defended myself. But I didn't. Instead, I did what I'd learned to do best over 38 years of being overlooked. I stayed silent. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with a steady hand. My face remained calm, composed, almost serene. No one at that table could see the familiar ache spreading through my chest, that old wound reopening with surgical precision. No one could see the little girl inside me who still, despite everything, wanted her father to look at her with pride instead of pity. I excused myself, quietly pushing back my chair without drama or protest. "I should get going," I said softly. "Early morning tomorrow." No one tried to stop me. My father had already turned back to Melissa, discussing property taxes and neighborhood schools. Linda was refilling wine glasses. The conversation moved on as if I'd never been there at all. I walked through the familiar hallway, past the framed family photos that featured Melissa prominently, and me barely at all, and stepped out into the cool evening air. My car sat in the driveway and I headed toward it with measured steps, my heels clicking against the pavement. That's when my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out, expecting a work email or a message from a friend. Instead, I saw a notification from Jennifer Chen, my real estate broker in the city. My breath caught as I read the preview. "The mansion you inquired about is now available for private sale." I stopped walking. For a moment, I just stood there in my father's driveway, staring at those words on the screen. The mansion. The $3.8 million property I'd been casually browsing online for the past month, the one I'd asked Jennifer about more out of curiosity than serious intent. The same mansion I realized with a jolt of recognition that Melissa had been posting about on social media, screenshots of the listing captions about her dream home, countdowns to her scheduled viewing next week. The humiliation I'd just endured suddenly crystallized into something else entirely. Not anger exactly. Not even revenge, not yet. But something sharper, clearer, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. I opened the full message. "The mansion you asked about is now available for exclusive sale. Owner wants a quick, quiet transaction. Cash buyers preferred. If you're interested, we need to move fast before it goes public next week." My finger hovered over the screen. Inside the house behind me, my family was probably still celebrating Melissa's good fortune. Probably still pitying poor Erica, who would never amount to anything. They had no idea what I was capable of. They had no idea who I'd become, and in that moment, standing alone in the gathering darkness, I decided they were about to find out. I sat in my car for a long time after reading that message, the engine off the windows slowly fogging from my breath in the cool night air. My father's house glowed warmly behind me, full of laughter and family, and belonging, all the things that had never quite included me. And as I stared at those glowing windows, memories I'd spent years trying to bury began surfacing one after another, like stones I'd thrown into deep water, finally floating back to the surface. I was 7 years old the first time I realized love in my family wasn't distributed equally. It was my birthday, and my mother had baked a chocolate cake from scratch, my favorite. She'd saved money from her grocery budget for weeks to buy me the art set I'd been dreaming about, 72 colored pencils in a wooden case. I remember thinking it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. But what I remember even more clearly was my father's face when I opened it. He glanced at the gift, nodded absently, and turned his attention back to the television. No hug. No happy birthday, sweetheart. Just a vague acknowledgement that something had happened before he returned to what really mattered to him. 2 weeks later, Melissa, who wasn't even my sister yet, just the daughter of the woman my father had started seeing, had a birthday party at our house. She turned 5. My father bought her a bicycle with pink streamers, and Abel spent the entire afternoon teaching her to ride it, laughing every time she wobbled, catching her before she could fall. I watched from the porch steps, my new colored pencils forgotten in my lap, trying to understand what made her so much more deserving of his attention than me. That pattern continued for years. When I brought home straight A's on my report card, my father would glance at it and say something like, "That's what I expect from you," before setting it aside. But when Melissa got a B+ in math after my father had remarried her mother and she'd become a permanent fixture in our home, he took her out for ice cream to celebrate her hard work. When I won the school science fair in 8th grade, he missed the awards ceremony because of a work meeting. When Melissa made the JV cheerleading squad in high school, he left work early to attend her first game. My mother saw it all. She was the only one who did. She'd pull me aside after these invisible wounds were inflicted and hold me close, telling me I was brilliant and talented and worthy of love. "Your father doesn't know how to show affection," she'd whisper into my hair. "But I see you, Erica. I see exactly who you are, and you're magnificent." Those moments with her were the only time I felt like I mattered, like I wasn't just taking up space in a family that would have been happier without me. Then 3 months after my 16th birthday, my mother got sick. It started with fatigue, then weight loss, then the diagnosis none of us wanted to hear. Stage 4, cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lasted 4. I remember those final months in fragments, the hospital smell that clung to her clothes even at home, the way her hand felt lighter and more fragile every time I held it, the sound of her labored breathing in the night. I remember sitting beside her bed doing my homework while she slept, terrified to leave her side, because what if those were the last moments we'd have together? My father was rarely there. He'd visit for an hour in the evenings, awkward and uncomfortable around illness, then retreat to his office or a business dinner or anywhere that didn't require him to face what was happening. When she died, I shattered. Not visibly, I'd already learned to hide my pain, but internally completely. The only person who had ever truly seen me was gone, and I was left in a house with a father who barely knew I existed. I thought naively that maybe her death would bring us closer, that maybe losing her would help him finally see me, his daughter, who was grieving just as much as he was. Instead, 4 months later, he married Linda. I came home from school one day to find her moving boxes into our house. My mother's clothes were already gone from the closet. Her photos had been taken down from the hallway. It was as if she'd never existed at all, erased and replaced before I'd even had time to process that she was really gone. Linda wasn't a monster. She didn't hit me or scream at me or lock me in closets like some evil stepmother from a fairy tale. Her cruelty was quieter, more insidious. It was in the way her eyes would slide past me when I entered a room as if I were a piece of furniture she'd rather not acknowledge. It was in the way she'd sigh with faint exasperation whenever I asked for anything money for a school trip, a ride to a friend's house, help with college applications. It was in the tone of her voice when she spoke to me, versus when she spoke to Melissa, warm and engaged for her daughter, flat and dismissive for me. Melissa was 10 when they got married, and overnight she became the center of the household. My father doted on her with an intensity that felt almost aggressive in its contrast to how he treated me. She got new clothes every season while I wore hand-me-downs from cousins. She got driving lessons in a car my father bought specifically for her to practice in. I had to save for months from my part-time job at the library to pay for my own lessons. She got help with college tuition. I got student loans and a work-study program that had me pulling double shifts at a campus coffee shop. I learned during those years that I was entirely on my own, not in a dramatic running away from home kind of way, but in the quiet, grinding reality of daily survival. At 16, I started working 20 hours a week at the library, then added weekend shifts at a grocery store. I paid for my own clothes, my own school supplies, my own everything. When I got into college, a good one with a partial academic scholarship I'd earned through sheer determination, my father's only comment was, "Well, I hope you can afford it." I could. Barely. I worked 3 jobs. My freshman year slept 4 hours a night and graduated with honors and a mountain of debt. But I also graduated with something more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that I could survive anything. That I didn't need my father's approval, or Linda's acceptance, or Melissa's acknowledgement. I had built myself from nothing and no one could take that away from me. Or so I thought until tonight when my father's words cut through all those carefully constructed defenses and reminded me that some wounds never fully heal. I was about to start my car and drive back to the city when I heard voices. The front door of the house had opened and my father and Linda stepped onto the porch, their conversation drifting clearly through the quiet evening air. "The realtor confirmed the viewing for next Thursday," Linda was saying. "Melissa is so excited. The $3.8 million house, can you imagine?" My father chuckled. "She deserves it. She's worked hard." I sat frozen in my car, listening to them discuss my stepsister's dream mansion as if it were already hers, as if the money they were giving her was somehow earned rather than simply handed over because she'd been born into the right side of their affection. And that's when I made my decision. I drove back to the city that night with my father's words echoing in my mind. But somewhere around mile 40 on the highway, something shifted inside me. The hurt began transforming into something harder, sharper. Not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about who I was versus who my family believed me to be. They had no idea. None of them had any idea at all. The truth was, I'd stopped being the struggling daughter they imagined years ago. Maybe I'd never been her at all, not really. What my father saw when he looked at me, if he bothered to look at all, was a projection of his own limited expectations. He saw a woman who'd left for the city without his financial support, who worked in some vague computer job he'd never cared enough to ask about, who lived in an apartment he'd never visited, and led a life he'd never inquired into. He assumed struggle because he wanted to assume it. It made Melissa's success, built on his money and connections, feel more impressive by comparison. But assumption and reality are very different things. 7 years ago, I'd been working as a mid-level software developer at a decent company, making a comfortable salary but nothing extraordinary. I was good at my job, good enough that I started noticing inefficiencies in how small businesses manage their customer databases. Most of them were using clunky, expensive enterprise software that required IT specialists to maintain, or they were limping along with spreadsheets that couldn't scale. There was a gap in the market, a need that nobody seemed to be addressing. So I spent my evenings and weekends building something better. A streamlined, intuitive database management system designed specifically for small to medium businesses, restaurants, boutiques, local service providers. Something affordable and simple enough that a shop owner could implement it themselves without hiring a consultant. I taught myself additional programming languages, studied user interface design, tested and retested, until the software was as close to perfect as I could make it. 18 months later, I had a working product. 6 months after that, I had 300 paying customers. And then a Fortune 500 company that specialized in business solutions noticed what I'd built. They made an offer, a substantial offer. The kind of number that makes you read the email 3 times to make sure you're not hallucinating. I sold the software for 7 figures. After taxes and paying off my student loans in a single satisfying transaction, I had enough left to change my life completely. But I didn't buy a sports car or a penthouse or any of the obvious trappings of sudden wealth. Instead, I did what my mother had taught me, what years of financial insecurity had drilled into my bones. I invested carefully. Stocks, index funds, a small but promising real estate portfolio. I lived in the same modest apartment, drove the same reliable sedan, shopped at the same grocery stores. Not because I was afraid or ashamed of my success, but because I genuinely didn't need the external validation. The money meant freedom to me, not status. Freedom from ever having to depend on my father, from ever having to ask him for anything, from ever having to sit at his table and swallow his dismissiveness, because I needed his financial support. I was free, and that freedom was worth more than any designer handbag or luxury vacation. My family never knew because my father never asked. In 15 years of occasional phone calls and obligatory holiday visits, he'd never once said, "How's work going, Erica?" or "Tell me about what you're working on." The few times I'd tried to share something about my career, his eyes would glaze over and he'd change the subject to something about Melissa. Eventually, I stopped trying. Let him think what he wanted. It didn't matter anymore. Except I was learning tonight it still did matter. At least a little. At least enough to hurt. Over the years, I'd used some of my wealth the way I wished someone had used theirs for me. I donated quietly to scholarship funds for first-generation college students. I invested in startups run by women entrepreneurs, particularly those who'd grown up without family support or financial safety nets. I mentored young women in tech who reminded me of my younger self, brilliant and determined, but lacking the connections and encouragement that make success easier. These acts brought me more satisfaction than any amount of money in my bank account ever could. I thought I'd moved past needing my family's recognition. I thought I'd transcended the hurt of being overlooked, that I'd built a life so full and meaningful that their opinions couldn't touch me anymore. And mostly that was true. I'd gone months, sometimes years, without thinking about my father's favoritism, or Linda's cold dismissiveness, or Melissa's unearned advantages. But tonight had ripped open something I'd thought was healed. Not the wound itself, maybe, but the scar tissue protecting it. And as I drove through the darkness toward the city lights, I realized that what I needed wasn't revenge. I'd never been the vengeful type. What I needed was closure. A way to finally definitively close the chapter of my life, where I was the invisible daughter, the forgotten child, the one who would never measure up. The mansion had been on my radar for about a month, though not seriously. I'd been browsing real estate listings the way some people browse travel websites, half fantasy, half genuine interest in what might be possible. I didn't need a mansion. My apartment was perfectly adequate. But I'd been thinking lately about wanting more space, maybe a home office with actual walls instead of a corner of my bedroom. Perhaps a garden where I could grow herbs and vegetables like my mother used to. When I'd seen the listing for the $3.8 million property, I'd clicked on it more out of curiosity than intent. It was beautiful, a sprawling estate with floor-to-ceiling windows, mature landscaping, and a kind of quiet elegance that appealed to something deep in my soul. I'd sent the listing to my broker Jennifer with a casual, "What do you know about this place?" I'd had no real plans to pursue it. Then, scrolling through social media a week ago, I'd seen Melissa's posts. Screenshots of the same mansion, captions about her future home and dream house, and "Can't wait to see it next week." She'd even created a Pinterest board of furniture and decoration ideas, publicly planning her life in a house she didn't own yet, funded by money she hadn't earned. And now, sitting in my father's driveway after being humiliated at his dinner table, that broker's message felt like fate handing me an opportunity I hadn't known I was waiting for. I opened my email app and typed a response to Jennifer with steady fingers. "I'm very interested. What do I need to do to move forward quickly?" Her reply came through almost immediately. "If you decide now, you can purchase before it goes public." Jennifer met me at the mansion the following morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I'd barely slept, my mind racing through numbers and possibilities, and the strange sensation that something significant was about to shift in my life. She was waiting in the circular driveway when I pulled up, her professional smile warm and genuine as I stepped out of my car into the crisp morning air. The house was even more beautiful in person than it had been in photographs. It sat on 2 acres of meticulously maintained grounds, the architecture a perfect blend of classical elegance and modern functionality. Tall windows reflected the morning sun, and the stone facade gave it a sense of permanence and solidity that felt almost metaphorical. This was a house built to last, built to shelter, built to be a home in the truest sense of the word. Jennifer unlocked the front door and gestured for me to enter first. The moment I stepped inside, something unexpected happened. A feeling washed over me that I couldn't quite name at first. Not excitement, not triumph, but something quieter and deeper. Peace. That's what it was. A bone-deep sense of peace I couldn't remember ever experiencing before, certainly not in any house I'd ever called home. The entryway opened into a spacious living area with hardwood floors that gleamed in the natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The space felt both grand and intimate, somehow large enough to breathe, but warm enough to feel embracing. I walked slowly through the rooms, Jennifer trailing behind, offering details about square footage and recent renovations, but I was only half listening. I was too busy feeling the rightness of being here, the way the house seemed to fit around me, like it had been waiting. When I reached the back of the house, I stopped in front of a wall of glass doors that overlooked the garden. The yard stretched out in gentle slopes, dotted with mature trees that must have been growing for decades. There was a stone patio of fountain flower beds that would be spectacular in spring. Morning sunlight turned everything golden, and standing there looking out at this peaceful sanctuary, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Memories of my mother flooded in, unbidden but welcome. I remembered her kneeling in our small backyard garden when I was 8 or 9, showing me how to plant tomato seedlings, her hands gentle and sure. I remembered her sitting with me at our kitchen table late into the night when I was struggling with algebra homework, never losing patience, always believing I could figure it out. I remembered the way she'd look at me sometimes, really look at me and say, "You're going to do remarkable things, Erica. You're going to have a beautiful life." She'd died before she could see me build that life, before she could know that her faith in me hadn't been misplaced. But standing in this mansion, looking out at this garden where I could plant my own tomatoes if I wanted, I felt connected to her in a way I hadn't in years. This house, this beautiful safe space, this was what she would have wanted for me. Not because it was expensive or impressive, but because it was mine. Because it represented everything I'd fought for: security, stability, independence, peace. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely proud of myself without needing anyone else's approval to validate that pride. This house wasn't just something I could afford, it was something I deserved. I'd earned it through years of hard work, through sacrifice and determination, and refusing to give up even when I had no support. Every late-night coding, every double shift at those college jobs, every moment of doubt I'd pushed through it, had all led here to this sun-drenched room in this beautiful house that could be mine if I chose to claim it. I didn't need my father to acknowledge my success. I didn't need Melissa to see me as an equal. I didn't need Linda's approval or my relatives' respect. I had something more valuable than any of that. I had proof tangible and undeniable that I had exceeded every low expectation they'd ever held for me. Not to prove them wrong, I was past caring what they thought, but to prove to myself that I was exactly who my mother had believed I could be. Jennifer appeared beside me, and I realized I'd been standing silently for several minutes. She smiled gently, as if she understood that something more than a property viewing was happening here. "It's a special house," she said softly. "The family who lived here raised 3 children. They said it was the happiest place they'd ever known." I nodded, not trusting my voice for a moment. Then I asked, "You mentioned the owners want a quick sale." "Yes, they've already relocated for work. They're motivated to close fast, preferably with minimal showings." She paused, glancing at her phone. "Actually, I should mention there is one other party interested. A younger woman. She's scheduled to view the property next Thursday." My heart skipped a beat. I knew without asking who that younger woman was. "Next Thursday," I repeated, keeping my voice neutral. "Yes, though of course nothing's committed until there's an offer." Jennifer looked at me carefully. "I sense you have a real connection to this place. If you're seriously interested, I'd recommend moving quickly before it becomes a multiple offer situation." I turned back to the windows, looking out at the garden that could be my garden, the home that could be my home. The universe had placed this opportunity in my path at the exact moment I needed it most. Melissa thought this house would be hers, funded by our father's money, and given to her like everything else in her life had been given. She'd probably never had to fight for anything, never had to prove herself, never had to wonder if she was worthy. But I had. I'd fought for everything. And this house, this beautiful space that felt like coming home to a place I'd never been, this was mine to claim if I wanted it. Not to take something from Melissa, she'd never actually had it to begin with, but to give something to myself. To finally, definitively step into the life I'd built and own it completely without apology or hesitation. The decision crystallized with perfect clarity. I turned to Jennifer, and my voice was steady when I spoke. "If I pay cash today, can I have it?" Jennifer's eyes widened slightly, the only outward sign of her surprise. In all the years I'd worked with her through smaller real estate transactions and investment properties, I'd never made a decision this large, this quickly. But she was professional enough to recover immediately, pulling out her tablet to begin accessing the necessary documents. "I can have the paperwork ready by this afternoon," she said, her fingers already moving across the screen. "If you're certain, we can move very fast. The sellers specifically requested a quick close, and cash removes all the complications of financing contingencies." "I'm certain," I said, and I was. More certain than I'd been about anything in a long time. We spent the next hour in her car going over details. I transferred funds from my investment accounts, coordinated with my financial advisor, reviewed inspection reports the sellers had already commissioned. Jennifer worked with remarkable efficiency, and by early afternoon we were sitting in her office downtown with a stack of documents in front of us. Before I signed anything, I had one specific request. "I need complete confidentiality about this purchase," I told her, meeting her eyes directly. "The identity of the buyer should not be disclosed to anyone outside the necessary legal channels, especially not to the woman scheduled to view the property next week." Jennifer nodded, making notes. "That's actually not unusual for high-value properties. Many buyers prefer privacy. I'll include a specific confidentiality clause in the documentation, and I'll personally handle any inquiries about the property's status." "What will you tell her when she shows up for the viewing?" I asked. "Simply that the property has been sold and is no longer available. That's all I'm legally required to disclose." She paused, studying me with intelligent eyes. "May I ask if there's a particular reason for the confidentiality beyond normal privacy preferences?" I considered how much to share, then decided honesty was simpler. "The scheduled viewer is my stepsister. My family doesn't know about my financial situation, and I'd prefer to control when and how that information is revealed." Understanding crossed Jennifer's face, followed by what might have been a hint of admiration. "I see. Don't worry, Ms. Fisher. Your secret is completely safe with me." We signed the papers at 4:30 that afternoon. The sellers accepted my offer immediately, all cash, no contingencies, quick close. Jennifer said it was one of the smoothest transactions she'd handled in years. By the time I walked out of her office, I was the legal owner of a $3.8 million mansion, and my stepsister's viewing appointment next Thursday had become completely irrelevant. I expected to feel triumphant, or at least satisfied in some vindictive way. But as I drove back to my apartment through rush-hour traffic, what I actually felt was an unexpected calm settling over me like a blanket. It wasn't the electric thrill of victory or the sharp pleasure of getting even. It was something quieter and more profound, a sense of rightness that went bone deep. For 38 years I'd been operating in reactive mode, reacting to my father's neglect, reacting to my stepmother's coldness, reacting to the constant message that I was less than not enough, unworthy of the love and support freely given to Melissa. Even my success had been in some ways a reaction, proof that I could survive without them, that I could build a life despite their dismissal. But this was different. This wasn't reactive. This was proactive, decisive, an act of pure agency. I had chosen something for myself, claimed something I wanted, and in doing so, I'd crossed some invisible threshold. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore, not really. I was a woman who knew her worth and had the means to honor it. The transformation felt complete in a way I hadn't anticipated. Revenge. I realized it didn't have to be cruel or loud or designed to inflict pain. Sometimes the most powerful revenge was simply living well, choosing well, rising so far above the people who tried to diminish you that their opinions became irrelevant. I hadn't bought the mansion to hurt Melissa or prove something to my father. I'd bought it because I deserved it, because it felt like home, because I could. That their surprise would be a side effect was just an added bonus. I spent the evening in my apartment ordering takeout and sipping wine while I looked through the property documents again. My mansion. My home. The words felt surreal and wonderful. I imagined my mother's reaction if she could see me now, and I thought she'd be proud. Not of the money or the mansion specifically, but of the woman I'd become strong enough to claim what I deserved without apology. I was considering an early night when my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen, and I stared at it for a moment before answering. He rarely called me. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time he'd initiated contact that wasn't related to a holiday or family obligation. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Erica." His voice sounded strange, heavier than usual, lacking the dismissive edge it had carried at dinner. "I need you to come back home this weekend. We need to have a family discussion." I frowned, switching the phone to my other ear. "About what?" There was a pause longer than comfortable. When he spoke again, there was something in his tone I couldn't quite identify. Stress, maybe, or worry. "It's important. It's about Melissa," he said, then added after another pause. "And money." My stomach tightened slightly. The timing felt too coincidental, though I couldn't imagine how he could possibly know about the mansion purchase yet. Jennifer had promised confidentiality, and the transaction had only been finalized hours ago. "What about Melissa and money?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Not over the phone. Can you be here Saturday afternoon? Around 2. Every instinct told me this was connected to something larger, something I didn't yet understand. But I was no longer the powerless daughter who had to jump when her father called. I had options now. I had strength. "I'll think about it," I said carefully. "I'll let you know." "Erica," his voice took on an edge of something that sounded almost like pleading. "It's important. Please." The word please from my father was so unusual that it made me pause. He didn't ask. He commanded, expected, assumed compliance. "I'll think about it," I repeated, then ended the call before he could press further. I sat in my quiet apartment, the phone still in my hand, my wine growing warm on the coffee table. Saturday was 4 days away. Melissa's viewing was scheduled for Thursday. Something was happening, pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite see yet shifting into place. "It's about Melissa and money," my father had said, and those words echoed in my mind long into the night. I decided to go to the Saturday dinner, partly out of curiosity about what my father wanted to discuss, but mostly because I wanted to see their faces when they talked about the mansion that was no longer available. Melissa's viewing had been scheduled for Thursday just 2 days ago. By now, Jennifer would have informed her that the property had been sold. I wondered if they knew yet, or if this dinner was planned before they'd received the news. I arrived at 2 o'clock exactly, parking in the same spot I'd occupied just a week earlier when my father had humiliated me in front of the extended family. But this time felt different. This time I walked up the familiar path to the front door carrying a secret that changed everything, a knowledge that shifted the entire power dynamic, even if no one else realized it yet. Linda answered the door, her smile polite but distant as always. "Erica, you're here. Come in." She stepped aside to let me pass, already turning away before I'd fully entered her attention, immediately returning to whatever she'd been doing in the kitchen. No, how are you? No, thanks for coming. Just the minimal acknowledgement required by basic politeness. The house smelled like roasted chicken and garlic, the same meal Linda had served at the last dinner. I could hear voices from the dining room, my father's deep rumble, and Melissa's lighter, more animated tones. As I walked toward the sound, I braced myself for whatever scene I was about to encounter. What I found was my father and Melissa sitting at the dining table, surrounded by printed materials, real estate listings, mortgage calculators, what looked like furniture catalogs. Melissa's laptop was open in front of her, displaying what I recognized as an interior design website. They were so absorbed in their planning that neither looked up when I entered. The master suite would be perfect for a walk-in closet renovation. Melissa was saying, her finger tracing something on one of the printouts. I've already found a contractor who specializes in luxury closet systems. My father nodded indulgently. Whatever you want, sweetheart. This is your dream home. We want it to be perfect. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, waiting for someone to acknowledge my presence. Linda bustled past me carrying a platter of roasted vegetables, barely glancing in my direction. Finally, I cleared my throat. Hello? I said quietly. My father looked up, his expression distracted. Oh, Erica. Good you're here. Sit down. We'll eat in a few minutes. Then, without waiting for my response, he turned back to Melissa. Show me that photo again of the backyard. We should think about putting in a pool. I took a seat near the end of the table, the same position I always occupied, and watched them continue their planning session as if I weren't there. Melissa scrolled through photos on her laptop, showing my father different angles of a property I now owned. She'd clearly screenshot every image from the listing before her viewing had been canceled, probably intending to use them for her Pinterest board of renovation dreams. The kitchen is already beautiful, but I think I'd replace the countertops with marble, she said. And maybe add a wine fridge. Oh, and look at this garden space, Dad. Can you imagine the parties we could have there? We'll host Thanksgiving, my father agreed enthusiastically. Finally, a proper house for family gatherings. This place is getting too small now that you girls are grown. I almost laughed at that. You girls. As if Melissa and I were equivalent in his eyes, as if we'd both been raised with the same care and attention. As if this house he was sitting in wasn't perfectly adequate for gatherings. It had been my mother's house, once carefully chosen and lovingly maintained. But apparently it wasn't good enough now that Melissa wanted something grander. Linda called us to dinner, and we all moved to our usual positions around the table. The food was served. Wine was poured for everyone except me. No one thought to ask if I wanted any, and the conversation continued to revolve entirely around Melissa's mansion plans. Have you thought about the timeline? Linda asked her daughter. When do you think you'll be able to move in? Melissa practically glowed. Well, I'm viewing it Thursday, and if everything looks good, we'll make an offer right away. Dad's helping with the down payment, and I've already been pre-approved for the mortgage. We could probably close within a month. Thursday. Past tense as of today. I wondered when Jennifer had called her whether Melissa had been devastated or simply assumed she'd find another property. But no one had mentioned anything about the viewing being canceled, which meant either they didn't know yet or they were keeping it quiet. My father turned to me suddenly as if remembering I existed. You know, Erica, you should really think about getting more serious about your own housing situation. You're not getting any younger, and rent in the city must be expensive. I took a sip of water, saying nothing. He continued, warming to his topic. You need to be realistic about what you can afford. Not everyone can have a mansion like Melissa. There's no shame in a modest apartment or maybe a small condo somewhere affordable. The important thing is not to overextend yourself trying to keep up with your sister. The words landed exactly as he'd intended them, a reminder of my place, a recalibration of expectations, a gentle but firm pushback into the box he'd constructed for me years ago. Erica, the struggling daughter. Erica, who needed advice on being realistic. Erica, who should know better than to compete with golden child Melissa. Linda nodded along with his words. Your father's right, dear. It's important to live within your means. Melissa has worked very hard and made smart choices. Not everyone is in her position. I looked at Melissa, then really looked at her. She had the grace to appear slightly uncomfortable with the comparison, her eyes dropping to her plate. But she didn't contradict them. She didn't say, actually, Dad and Linda are giving me hundreds of thousands of dollars for this house. She didn't acknowledge that her position was built entirely on our father's money, not her own merit. She just sat there accepting the narrative that she'd somehow earned what I supposedly hadn't. I appreciate the advice, I said evenly, my voice betraying nothing of what I was thinking. My father smiled, satisfied that he'd imparted fatherly wisdom. Good. I just don't want you to feel bad about where you are in life. Everyone's path is different. Melissa's just been fortunate to have more opportunities. Opportunities. The word was almost funny. Opportunities that I'd created for myself through sheer determination, while Melissa's opportunities had been handed to her on a silver platter. But I didn't say any of that. I simply nodded and took another bite of chicken. The dinner continued in the same vein, with most of the conversation centered on Melissa's impending mansion purchase and my father's obvious pride in her accomplishments. I was addressed directly maybe 3 times in the entire meal, each time to receive some piece of condescending advice about managing my life more sensibly. I remained quiet throughout it all, but inside I was observing everything with crystal clarity. The casual cruelty of their dismissal, the way they'd constructed a narrative where Melissa was successful and I was struggling, and how comfortable they all were with that story. The complete lack of curiosity about my actual life, my actual circumstances, my actual achievements. Every word out of my father's mouth, every indulgent smile he gave Melissa, every piece of advice he offered me about being realistic. It all reinforced something I already knew, but was now feeling with renewed intensity. I hadn't bought that mansion out of spite. I'd bought it because I deserved it, because I'd earned it, and because no one in this family would ever give me credit for what I'd accomplished unless I forced them to see it. As dessert was being served, Linda's apple pie. Melissa's favorite, my father raised his wineglass in a small toast. To Melissa's new beginning, he said warmly, and to tomorrow, when we'll all get to see this beautiful mansion she's chosen. I can't wait to tour it with you, sweetheart. Melissa's face went pale. She set down her fork carefully, and I saw her exchange a quick glance with Linda. Actually, Dad, she said slowly, there's been a change of plans. The realtor called yesterday. The property sold. Someone bought it before my viewing. The silence that followed was profound. My father's smile froze, his wineglass suspended midair. What? He said finally. What do you mean it sold? Someone made a cash offer and closed immediately. Melissa said, her voice tight with disappointment. It's gone. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, my eyes on my pie, my hands steady. Inside, my heart was beating faster, but outwardly, I gave away nothing. My father's face reddened. That's unacceptable. Who was their realtor? We should file a complaint. You had an appointment scheduled. They should have honored that. It doesn't work that way, Dad, Melissa said quietly. They accepted a better offer. It happens. The rest of the dinner dissolved into my father and Linda trying to comfort Melissa, assuring her they'd find something even better, something even more perfect. I finished my pie in silence and prepared to leave satisfied that I'd witnessed exactly what I'd come to see. As I was gathering my purse, my father called out, "Erica, wait. That thing I wanted to discuss, we'll have to do it another time. This isn't the right moment." I nodded, heading toward the door. But just as I reached it, I heard my father say to Melissa, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Tomorrow we'll start looking at new properties. We'll find you something even better than that mansion." I stepped out into the evening air, closing the door quietly behind me. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, everything would change. I woke up Sunday morning with a strange mix of anticipation and calm settling in my chest. I knew what today would bring, had known since the moment my father mentioned at dinner that they'd be looking at new properties. What I hadn't anticipated was the text message I received at 8 a.m. from a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Fisher, this is Robert Chen from Prestige Realty. Your broker Jennifer asked me to reach out. I've been assigned a viewing today at 2 p.m. for a family named Fisher, your father and stepsister. They don't know the property has been sold. Jennifer thought you'd want to know. I'll follow your lead on how to handle the situation. I stared at the message for a long moment, my coffee growing cold in my hand. So they'd found another realtor, probably from a different agency, and had somehow gotten a viewing scheduled at my mansion. The property must not have been fully removed from all the listing services yet. Or perhaps Robert was simply being professional and honoring an appointment made before the sale went through. Either way, the universe was handing me an opportunity I hadn't even planned for. I typed back, "Thank you for letting me know. I'll be there. Please don't mention that the property has an owner until I arrive." His response came quickly. "Understood. See you at 2. I spent the morning in a strange state of focused calm, the kind of clarity that comes when you know something significant is about to happen and you're ready for it. I dressed carefully, nothing too flashy, just well-tailored black pants and a silk blouse, the kind of understated elegance that speaks of quiet confidence. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in a $3.8 million mansion, someone who had earned her place there. At 1:45, I drove to the property. I didn't park in the circular driveway where I might be immediately visible. Instead, I pulled onto a side street with a view of the entrance and waited, my hands steady on the steering wheel. My father's Mercedes arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. I watched as Linda and Melissa emerged from the car, their expressions eager and excited. Melissa was dressed in what I recognized as a new outfit, designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I used to make in a month at my college jobs. She looked like someone preparing to take possession of her castle, and the confidence in her stride made something twist in my chest. A man I assumed was Robert Chen greeted them at the door, professional and welcoming. I could see them shaking hands, see my father gesturing broadly as he said something that made the realtor nod. Then they all disappeared inside the house. I waited exactly 5 minutes before getting out of my car. I wanted them to get comfortable, to start imagining their lives in those rooms, to feel that sense of ownership that comes from walking through a space and mentally claiming it. When I entered through the front door using the key I'd received when I closed on the property, I could hear their voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the house. I moved quietly through the entryway, following the sound toward the back of the mansion, where the glass doors overlooked the garden. My father's voice carried clearly. "And this area here would be perfect for a bar setup. We could do cocktail parties, holiday gatherings. Melissa, can you imagine Christmas dinner in this space?" "It's perfect, Dad," Melissa's voice responded, breathless with excitement. "Everything about it is perfect." I could hear Robert's more measured tones interspersed with their enthusiasm, though I couldn't make out his exact words. He was clearly doing his job, showing them the property, even though he knew it was already sold. I appreciated his professionalism. Linda's voice joined in, "The kitchen is even more beautiful than in the photos. Melissa, you could do so much with this space. Have you thought about hiring an interior designer?" I moved closer, positioning myself near the entrance to the great room where I could see them, but they couldn't yet see me. My father stood in the center of the space, arms spread wide as if embracing his vision of the future. Melissa was at the windows looking out at the garden with an expression of pure longing. Linda stood near the kitchen entrance, already mentally rearranging cabinets. "We should discuss the offer strategy," my father was saying to Robert. "I want to move quickly on this. Put in a strong bid, maybe 10% over asking. I don't want to lose another property." Robert's expression was carefully neutral. "Mr. Fisher, I should mention," but my father cut him off, too excited to listen. "And the timeline, how fast can we close? Melissa wants to be in before the holidays if possible. Money isn't an issue. We're prepared to be very competitive." The entitlement in his voice was staggering. The assumption that he could simply decide he wanted something and it would be his. the complete confidence that his money would smooth every path, solve every problem. He'd lived his whole life this way, I realized, and it had never occurred to him that there might be obstacles his wealth and will couldn't overcome. That's when Robert spotted me. His eyes widened slightly in recognition. Jennifer must have sent him my photo, and he took a small step back, his professional mask slipping for just a moment as he understood what was about to happen. My father noticed his distraction and turned to see what had caught the realtor's attention. His eyes passed over me without recognition, at first, probably because I was so completely out of context. Then they came back confused, trying to place why I looked familiar. Robert recovered quickly and moved toward me, his voice low. "Ms. Fisher," he said quietly, "would you like me to explain the situation?" The question hung between us, heavy with implication. He was offering to do the hard part, to be the bearer of news that would shatter my family's assumptions. It would be easier that way, cleaner. I could maintain my distance, let a stranger deliver the blow. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew that wasn't what I wanted. This moment had been building for 38 years. Every dismissal, every comparison, every time I'd been made to feel less than, it had all led here to this sun-drenched room in this beautiful house that was mine. If there was going to be a revelation, if the truth was finally going to be spoken, I wanted to be the one to speak it. I met Robert's eyes and saw understanding there. He knew what I was about to do, and he was giving me the choice. My father had finally placed me. "Erica," he said, his voice sharp with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Melissa turned from the window, her expression shifting from dreamy to puzzled. Linda moved closer to my father, her posture defensive. I looked at Robert and made my decision. When I spoke, my voice was clear and steady. "Wait a moment," I said, holding his gaze. "Let me do it myself." Robert stepped back slightly, giving me the space I needed. I could feel his professional curiosity about how this family drama would unfold, but he maintained his distance wisely, choosing to observe rather than interfere. I walked into the great room slowly, my footsteps echoing slightly on the hardwood floors. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows created patterns of light and shadow across the space, and for a moment no one moved. My father, Melissa, and Linda all stood frozen in their various positions, staring at me with expressions that ranged from confusion to growing alarm. "Erica?" My father repeated, his tone demanding now. "I asked you a question. What are you doing here?" I let the silence stretch for just a moment longer than comfortable, looking around the room that I'd fallen in love with, the space that had felt like home from the moment I'd first walked through it. Then I met my father's eyes directly and spoke with perfect calm. "Oh, hello," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the open space. "Welcome to my home." The words hung in the air like a bell that had been rung, their resonance filling every corner of the room. I watched as comprehension tried to form on their faces, and failed, tried again, and stumbled. It was as if I'd spoken in a foreign language they couldn't quite translate. Melissa was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What? This house?" I said, gesturing to the beautiful space around us. "It's mine. I purchased it last week." The color drained from Melissa's face so quickly, I almost felt concerned for her. She reached out blindly for something to steady herself, and found the back of a chair, gripping it with white knuckles. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked like someone had just told her the laws of physics had suddenly reversed. Linda's hand flew to her chest in a gesture of shock that would have been theatrical if it weren't so genuine. "That's impossible," she said, her voice sharp and thin. "You can't afford, you don't have—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate what she was thinking, because to say it out loud would be to acknowledge that their entire understanding of me was based on assumption rather than fact. My father's face went through a remarkable transformation. The confusion gave way to disbelief, the disbelief to something that looked almost like betrayal, and finally settled into a deep, burning anger that made his face flush red from his collar to his hairline. His jaw clenched and unclenched, and I could see him struggling to process information that fundamentally contradicted the narrative he'd constructed about his two daughters. "This is some kind of joke," he said finally, his voice hard. "Is this your idea of getting attention, Erica? Pretending you bought a house you clearly can't afford?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I turned to Robert, who had been standing near the doorway watching this unfold, with the carefully neutral expression of someone who's witnessing something far beyond his job description. "Robert," I said calmly, "would you mind confirming the ownership of this property?" He cleared his throat, professional to the end. "Of course." He pulled out his tablet, tapped the screen a few times, and then turned it so the display was visible to my father. "The property located at this address was sold on Tuesday of this week to Ms. Erica Fisher. The transaction was completed with a full cash payment of $3.8 million. Ms. Fisher is the legal owner of record." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of birds in the garden outside. My father's eyes were fixed on Robert's tablet screen, reading the words there as if he could make them say something different through sheer force of will. Melissa made a sound, then something between a gasp and a sob. Her perfect composure, the confidence she'd worn like armor her entire life, cracked completely. She sank into the chair she'd been gripping, her designer clothes and carefully styled hair suddenly seeming like a costume on someone who'd just realized they'd been playing the wrong part. "But you said," she started, her voice breaking, "at dinner you acted like you didn't say anything." "You never asked," I said simply. It wasn't cruel, just factual. In all the years we'd lived under the same roof and all the family dinners and holiday gatherings, not once had Melissa shown any curiosity about my life, my work, my accomplishments. She'd assumed I was struggling because that assumption made her feel superior, and I'd never corrected her because her opinion of me had ceased to matter long ago. Linda found her voice again, though it trembled. "Where did you get this kind of money? Did you marry someone wealthy? Take out loans?" The questions revealed so much about how she saw the world, how she saw me. In her mind, there was no possible universe in which I could have earned this kind of wealth on my own merit. There had to be a man involved, or debt, or some kind of deception. "I earned it," I said calmly. "I built a successful career in software development. I created a product that sold well. I invested wisely. The same way anyone builds wealth through hard work and smart decisions." My father was shaking his head, still refusing to accept what he was hearing. "That's not possible. You live in a small apartment. You drive an ordinary car. If you had this kind of money, we would have known." "Would you?" I asked quietly. "When was the last time you asked me about my work, Dad? When was the last time you inquired about my life in any meaningful way?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples of uncomfortable truth spreading outward. My father's mouth opened then closed. He had no answer because we both knew the truth he had never asked, because he had never cared enough to ask. "You let us believe," Melissa started, but I cut her off gently. "I didn't let you believe anything. You believed what you wanted to believe because it fit the story you preferred. I was the struggling daughter, you were the successful one. It made you feel better about yourself, so you never questioned it." Melissa's eyes filled with tears, and I felt a small pang of something that might have been sympathy. She'd been raised to measure her worth by comparison to me, taught that her value came from being better than the sister our father didn't love. And now that foundation was crumbling beneath her feet, and she didn't know who she was without it. Robert shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering if he should excuse himself from this increasingly personal family confrontation. But before he could move, my father took a step toward me, his face still red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was harsh, demanding, filled with an anger that felt disproportionate to the situation. But I understood it wasn't really about the house. It was about control, about the narrative he'd built, about the fact that I'd stepped outside the box he'd put me in, and he couldn't force me back into it. "How do you have this kind of money?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I want the truth, Erica. How did you really get it?" I looked at my father, this man who had never seen me, never valued me, never bothered to know me. And I realized that nothing I said in this moment would satisfy him because he didn't actually want the truth. He wanted an explanation that would restore his worldview, something he could use to dismiss my success as illegitimate or unearned. But I was done caring what he wanted. "I told you the truth," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Whether you choose to believe, it is entirely up to you." My father's face had gone from red to almost purple, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. The anger radiating from him filled the beautiful sun-filled room with a darkness that felt almost physical. I'd seen him angry before at traffic, at incompetent employees, at political news on television. But I'd never seen this particular shade of rage directed at me. It was unsettling not because it frightened me, but because it revealed something I'd always suspected, but never fully acknowledged. He didn't just dismiss me. On some level, he resented me. "You're lying," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "There's no way you earned this kind of money legitimately. What did you really do? Erica, did you steal from your employer? Embezzle funds? There has to be something you're not telling us." The accusation hit me like a slap, not because I believed it had any merit, but because of what it revealed about how he saw me. His daughter had just told him she'd built a successful career and purchased a multi-million-dollar home, and his first instinct wasn't pride or curiosity or even neutral acceptance. It was suspicion of criminal activity. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice level despite the hurt blooming in my chest, "I've never stolen anything in my life. I created software, sold it legally to a corporation, and invested the proceeds wisely. Everything I have, I earned." "I don't believe you," he shot back. "Women don't just make that kind of money in computers. You must have had help. Some man backing you, maybe. Or perhaps you were involved with someone wealthy and this is settlement money from a relationship gone bad." There it was. The real assumption underlying his disbelief. Not that I might have committed crimes, but that any success I'd achieved must have come through a man. I couldn't have built wealth through my own intelligence and hard work, because in his worldview, women simply didn't do that. Especially not his daughter, the one he'd written off as unremarkable years ago. Linda stepped closer to my father, her expression twisted with something ugly. "I always knew there was something off about you," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Always so quiet, so secretive. Now we know why. You were hiding things, doing God knows what in that city." "I wasn't hiding anything," I said calmly, though my heart was racing. "I just lived my life. You never asked about it. Because you made it clear you didn't want to be part of this family," Linda snapped. "Running off to the city, barely visiting, acting like you were too good for us. And now this stunt, buying a house you knew Melissa wanted just to hurt her." The accusation was so absurd, I almost laughed. "I bought this house because I wanted it for myself. I didn't even know Melissa was interested in it until after I'd already decided to make an offer." "Liar," Linda hissed. "You've always been jealous of Melissa. Ever since we became a family, you couldn't stand that she was prettier, more successful, more loved. And now you're trying to take away her happiness out of pure spite." I stared at her, this woman who had made my teenage years a quiet hell of emotional neglect and subtle cruelty, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, I was beyond anger now. What I felt was a kind of crystalline clarity, a perfect understanding that nothing I said or did would ever be right in her eyes, because she needed me to be wrong. She needed me to be the problem, because acknowledging the truth that she'd helped create a toxic family dynamic that damaged everyone involved would require a level of self-reflection she simply wasn't capable of. Melissa had been silent through this exchange, but now she made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup, and her hands were shaking where they gripped the chair. "This isn't fair," she choked out. "This was supposed to be my house. Dad promised. We had plans. How could you do this to me? And there in those words was the core of Melissa's worldview. Things were supposed to go her way because they always had. She'd been promised something, and the universe was meant to deliver it because that's how her life had always worked. The idea that someone else, especially someone she'd been taught to view as lesser, could want the same thing and actually get it first was incomprehensible to her. "Melissa," I said gently, trying to reach past her tears to whatever rational part of her might still be listening. "This house was on the open market. Anyone could buy it. I made an offer and it was accepted. That's how real estate works." "But I wanted it," she said, as if that should have been enough. As if her wanting something meant it should automatically be hers. "Dad was going to help me buy it. We had everything planned." "Plans change," I said. "Properties sell. This isn't personal." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Maybe purchasing the house hadn't been about taking something from Melissa, but there was no denying a certain satisfaction in this moment in watching the golden child realize that the world didn't actually revolve around her desires. My father had been pacing his anger, seemingly unable to find a productive outlet. Now he stopped and pointed a finger at me, his hand shaking slightly. "You did this on purpose," he said. "You knew Melissa wanted this house, and you bought it out from under her to get back at us for—" He waved his hand vaguely. "Whatever imagined slight you think you've suffered over the years." Imagined. The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "Dad, you publicly humiliated me at dinner last week. You told me I'd never have a house like Melissa. You've spent my entire life making it clear that I'm not good enough, not worthy of the same love and support you give her. None of that was imagined." "You're being dramatic," Linda interjected. "Your father treated you perfectly well. You were fed, clothed, given a roof over your head. What more did you want?" "I wanted to be seen," I said quietly. "I wanted someone to care about my achievements the way you all celebrated Melissa's. I wanted my father to ask about my life occasionally. I wanted to feel like I mattered." "Oh, please," Linda scoffed. "Always playing the victim. This is exactly why you were so difficult to love, Erica. Always wanting attention, always making everything about you." The gaslighting was so blatant, so textbook, that I almost felt sorry for her. This was how she'd survived, by rewriting history to make herself the reasonable one, and everyone who challenged her the problem. Robert had retreated to the far corner of the room, clearly desperately uncomfortable, but professionally obligated to stay until the showing was officially concluded. I caught his eye and saw sympathy there, and something else, respect maybe, for how I was handling this situation. Melissa suddenly stood up, her tears still flowing, but her voice gaining strength through what sounded like sheer desperation. "You have to sell this house to me," she demanded, her voice rising. "You don't even need it. You have an apartment. This was supposed to be mine. Dad will give you whatever you paid for it. You'll make your money back. Just sell it to me. Please." The please at the end was almost an afterthought tacked on when she remembered that she was asking for something rather than demanding it. But the entitlement in her voice was unmistakable. She genuinely believed that I should hand over my home simply because she wanted it more. I looked at my younger stepsister, this woman who had been given everything her entire life and had learned nothing about resilience or earning or dealing with disappointment. And I felt something close to pity. "No," I said simply. "This house is mine. I'm not selling it." Melissa's face crumpled completely. "But I need it," she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. "You have to sell this house to me." I left the mansion that afternoon with my family's accusations and demands still ringing in my ears, but their words had lost their power to wound me. Robert had finally intervened, politely but firmly escorting them out when it became clear the situation was escalating towards something uglier. As I watched them drive away, my father rigid with anger, Melissa still crying. Linda's face pinched with fury. I felt not triumph, but a strange sense of completion, as if a chapter that had been left open for decades was finally closing. The following morning, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a professional female voice introduced herself as Margaret Thornton, attorney at law. Ms. Fisher, I represent the estate of your late mother, Catherine Fisher. I apologize for not reaching out sooner, but there are some documents that have come to my attention that I believe you need to see. Would you be able to come to my office this week? My mother had been dead for 22 years. The idea that there were still legal matters involving her estate felt surreal, like receiving a message from beyond the grave. What kind of documents? I asked. I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, Margaret said carefully. But I can tell you this concerns assets your mother set aside specifically for you. I've been managing certain trusts on her behalf, and there are things you should have known years ago. We scheduled an appointment for Thursday afternoon. I spent the intervening days in a state of strange anticipation, my mind circling around the mystery of what my mother might have left behind and why I was only learning about it now. Margaret Thornton's office was in a prestigious building downtown, all glass and steel, and the quiet efficiency of serious money. She met me in a conference room lined with law books, a slim woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. Thank you for coming, she said, gesturing to a chair across from a stack of folders and documents. I want to start by apologizing. Your mother hired me when you were quite young with very specific instructions about when and how to deliver certain information to you. I've followed those instructions to the letter, but I recognize this must feel strange. When I was young, I repeated, my mother knew she was sick. Not at first, Margaret said gently, but she was aware of certain difficulties in your family dynamic. She wanted to ensure you'd be protected regardless of what happened to her. She opened the first folder and pulled out a document I recognized as a will, though not the simple version that had been read after my mother's death, the one that left everything to my father. This is your mother's actual will, Margaret explained. The complete version. She left some assets to your father, yes, but she also established a two-phase inheritance structure specifically for you. I leaned forward, my heart beginning to beat faster. Phase 1 was triggered when you turned 30, Margaret continued. At that time, you received land funds and stock shares that your mother had accumulated. Those came to you automatically through the trust structure she'd established. You may remember receiving some documentation about property and investments around that time. I did remember. 8 years ago, I'd received paperwork about some small parcels of land and stock certificates I'd assumed were minor inheritance pieces my mother had set aside. I'd been so busy building my software company that I'd simply handed everything to my financial advisor, who had incorporated it into my investment portfolio. Those assets, I realized now, had been the seed money that helped me become truly wealthy when I'd sold my software. And phase 2, I asked. Triggers when you turn 40, Margaret said, in approximately 2 years. At that point, you'll receive a trust account currently worth approximately $5 million, plus several pieces of premium real estate your mother invested in years ago. The properties have appreciated significantly. All told, phase 2 will make you quite wealthy, certainly wealthier than your father has ever been. The room seemed to tilt slightly. My mother, who had died when I was 16, had somehow seen far enough into the future to set up a financial structure that would protect me well into adulthood. Why the 2 phases? I asked. Margaret smiled slightly. Your mother was very intelligent. She knew that giving a young person too much money at once could be problematic. Phase 1 gave you enough to build on if you were wise, but not enough to coast on if you weren't. She wanted you to develop your own capability first. Phase 2 was insurance, a guarantee that no matter what happened, you'd have security and independence. Did my father know about this? Margaret's expression hardened. He knew about phase 2. Your mother told him before she died, partly as a warning. She made it very clear that you were protected, that you would have resources he couldn't touch. I believe she hoped it would make him treat you better, knowing you wouldn't need him eventually. It didn't work, I said quietly. No, Margaret agreed. If anything, I suspect it made things worse. Your father has been trying to maintain control over you for years, limiting you, dismissing you, keeping you emotionally dependent, even as you built financial independence. He knew that in 2 years you'd be completely beyond his reach. And I think on some level he's been trying to prevent that by keeping you psychologically subordinate. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. My father's cruelty hadn't been random or even just reflexive preference for Melissa. It had been strategic. He'd been trying to control me because he knew I represented something he couldn't dominate: my mother's legacy, her love, her belief in me. Every dismissal, every comparison to Melissa, every moment of making me feel small had been a calculated attempt to keep me from realizing my own power. "He's been afraid of me," I said slowly, the realization settling over me like a revelation. This whole time he's been afraid of what I'd become. "I believe so," Margaret said. "Your mother saw his nature clearly. That's why she protected you so thoroughly." She pulled out another folder, this one containing photographs and personal letters. On top was a picture I'd never seen before, my mother younger than I'd ever known her, standing in front of a beautiful house with elegant architecture and large windows. "Your mother took this photo when she was house hunting before you were born," Margaret explained. "She and your father looked at this property, but he refused to buy it, said it was too expensive, too impractical. Your mother never forgot it. She said it represented the kind of life she wanted for you: beautiful, peaceful, secure." I stared at the photograph at the house in the background with its graceful lines and abundant light. It wasn't the same house I'd just purchased, but the architecture was remarkably similar, the feeling almost identical. Had I somehow unconsciously sought out something that resembled my mother's dream? Beneath the photo was a handwritten note in my mother's familiar script. "My darling Erica, you deserve to live in a place that brings you peace. Don't settle for less than you're worth. Don't let anyone make you small. I love you always. Mom." Tears blurred my vision. My mother had died when I was 16, but she'd seen me clearly enough at 8 or 9 or 10 to know exactly what I'd need 2 decades later. She'd understood that I'd be dismissed and undervalued, and she'd built a fortress of financial security around me to ensure that no matter what happened, I'd be able to claim the life I deserved. "There's one more thing," Margaret said gently. "Something important that your father definitely didn't want you to know." I looked up, wiping my eyes, bracing myself for whatever revelation was coming next. Margaret's expression was grave as she pulled out a final document. "This concerns how your mother really died and what your father did in the months before she passed away. I think you need to know the truth, Erica. Your mother made sure I'd tell you when the time was right." She paused, meeting my eyes directly. "There's something important your father didn't want you to know," she said quietly. "And it changes everything you thought you understood about your family." Margaret slid a thick folder across the polished conference table toward me. The tab was labeled "David Fisher, Financial Records," in neat, precise handwriting. My father's name on an official document in my mother's lawyer's office felt ominous in a way I couldn't quite articulate. "Your mother asked me to monitor your father's financial situation after her death." Margaret began, her voice carefully neutral in the way lawyers speak when they're about to deliver devastating news. She was concerned about certain patterns she'd observed during their marriage: reckless spending, bad investments, a tendency toward gambling. She wanted to ensure he couldn't access the assets she'd set aside for you, no matter how desperate he became. I opened the folder, and the first document made my breath catch. It was a credit report recent showing my father's current financial status. The numbers were staggering. Nearly $470,000 in debt spread across multiple creditors. Business loans that had gone unpaid. Credit cards maxed out and defaulted on. And at the bottom of the list, marked in red, were several entries from companies I didn't recognize, lending services with interest rates that looked predatory even to my untrained eye. "What are these?" I asked, pointing to the unfamiliar creditors. Margaret's expression darkened. "Those are what we might call alternative lending sources, the kind that operate in gray areas of legality. Your father exhausted his conventional credit options years ago. These organizations, they have different collection methods." A chill ran through me. You mean loan sharks? That's not a term I can use professionally, Margaret said carefully. But yes, essentially, these aren't banks. They're groups that lend money to people who can't get it anywhere else, and they expect repayment through whatever means necessary. I flipped through more documents, seeing a pattern of financial disaster that stretched back years. Failed business ventures, a restaurant that closed within 6 months, a real estate flip that lost money, an investment in a startup that went bankrupt. And woven through it all, evidence of gambling, receipts from casinos, transfers to online betting sites. My father had been hemorrhaging money for at least a decade, maybe longer. He tried to use Mother's estate as collateral, I asked, remembering what Margaret had said earlier. Multiple times, she confirmed. He approached various lenders with documents claiming he had access to property and investments from your mother's estate. But the legal protections she put in place made that impossible. Everything she left you was locked in trusts he couldn't touch. Each time he tried and failed, I imagine his resentment toward you grew. You represented money he believed should have been his resources he desperately needed but couldn't access. The revelation reframed every cruel word, every dismissal, every moment of making me feel worthless. It hadn't been just about favoring Melissa, or even about grief over losing my mother. My father had been financially desperate for years, and I, protected by legal structures my mother had wisely established, had been untouchable. So he'd done the only thing he could, tried to keep me small. Keep me feeling dependent and inferior so that maybe one day I'd be vulnerable enough to manipulate. There's more, Margaret said quietly. Something that concerns Melissa. She pulled out another set of documents, these more recent. Communications between my father and representatives from one of those predatory lending groups. My hands started shaking as I read through them. The lenders had been pressuring my father for repayment. When he couldn't deliver, they'd started looking at other avenues for collecting their money. And somehow Melissa had come onto their radar. There were notes about her, her job, her social media presence, her lifestyle. My father had apparently been talking her up to these people, describing her as successful and well-connected, probably trying to buy himself time by making it seem like his family had resources. But the lenders had interpreted this differently. They saw Melissa not as proof of my father's stability, but as a potential target. The notes used words like naive, sheltered, and susceptible to influence. They were monitoring her, waiting for an opportunity to approach her directly about her father's debts. They're planning to go after her, I said, feeling sick. It appears that way, Margaret confirmed. These organizations sometimes target family members, especially ones who seem emotionally invested in maintaining family harmony. They count on people being willing to pay to protect their loved ones from harassment or worse. I thought of Melissa at the mansion, crying over a house she couldn't have, still believing that her father loved her and wanted what was best for her. She had no idea she was being sized up as a mark by dangerous people who saw her as nothing more than a route to collecting money. There's something else, Margaret said, her voice even quieter now. Something I discovered when I started digging into your father's recent activities. She showed me emails, text messages that had somehow been obtained through legal channels I didn't fully understand. Communications between my father and a man named Richard Thornburg, a businessman in his late 60s who owned a chain of regional hardware stores. The messages were couched in polite language, but the underlying transaction was clear. My father was arranging for Melissa to meet this man to spend time with him with the barely concealed intention of encouraging a romantic relationship. Thornburg had apparently mentioned being willing to invest in solving financial difficulties for the family of someone he cared about. The implication was nauseating. My father was essentially trying to marry Melissa off to a man old enough to be her father, using her as a commodity to clear his debts. Does Melissa know about any of this? I asked, my voice tight with anger. I have no way of knowing for certain, but based on these communications, I don't believe so. Your father has been very careful to present this as genuine matchmaking, concerned father wanting his daughter to meet a successful, stable man. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the full scope of what I was learning. My father wasn't just emotionally abusive and financially irresponsible. He was actively dangerous. He'd created a situation where Melissa was at risk from predatory lenders, and his solution was to essentially sell her to a wealthy older man who could pay off his debts. He saw his daughters, both of us, not as people he was responsible for protecting, but as assets he could leverage for his own benefit. My mother had known. Maybe not the specific details, but she'd understood his nature well enough to protect me with elaborate legal structures. She'd seen what he was capable of and had built walls around me that he couldn't breach. But she'd died before she could protect Melissa, who had been just a child when my father remarried. And now Melissa, raised to trust him and seek his approval, was walking blindly into a trap she didn't even know existed. "What can I do?" I asked Margaret. "Can we warn Melissa? Get her away from him?" "She's an adult," Margaret said carefully. "Legally, she can make her own choices about who she associates with, but you could certainly try to make her aware of the situation. Whether she'd believe you is another question, especially given your father's likely spin on your relationship." I gathered the documents, my mind already racing through possibilities. This wasn't about revenge anymore, if it ever really had been. This was about protecting someone who, despite years of being used as a weapon against me, was ultimately another victim of my father's toxicity. Melissa and I had both been damaged by him, just in different ways. She'd been raised to be dependent and compliant, valued for her appearance and her willingness to play whatever role he assigned her. And now that role was to be a bargaining chip in his desperate financial schemes. I was standing up to leave, thanking Margaret for her honesty and her help, when my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Erica Fisher?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Sandra Chen. I'm a friend of Melissa's. She asked me to call you because she's scared to contact you directly. Your father is looking for you. He's been calling everyone trying to find you, and he's really angry." Sandra paused. "Erica, I think Melissa might be in trouble. Real trouble. And she doesn't know who else to turn to." I told Sandra to give me her address, and I drove straight there, my mind racing through scenarios and contingencies. But when I pulled up to the coffee shop where she'd said she was waiting with Melissa, my phone rang again. This time it was a number I recognized, the security system at my new mansion alerting me to motion detected at the front entrance. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone and felt my blood run cold. My father's Mercedes was in the driveway, and I could see him on the front porch, pounding on the door with enough force that I worried he might damage it. He was alone, his face visible in the porch light, twisted with rage. I called Sandra back. "Change of plans. Bring Melissa to this address." I gave her the mansion's location. "Come to the back entrance. There's a gate code." I rattled off the numbers. "Let yourselves in through the garden. I'll meet you there." "What's happening?" Sandra asked, her voice tight with worry. "Just trust me. Keep Melissa safe. I'll handle this." I drove back to the mansion faster than I should have, my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. By the time I pulled up, my father had moved from pounding on the door to circling the house, peering in windows. When he saw my car, he strode toward me with such aggressive intent that I actually felt a flash of fear before anger overrode it. I got out of the car and faced him across the driveway. In the darkness, with only the exterior lights illuminating us, he looked almost like a stranger, or maybe he looked like himself for the first time, all pretense of civility stripped away. "Where is she?" he demanded without preamble. "Where's Melissa?" "Safe," I said calmly. "Away from you." His face contorted. "You have no right to interfere in my family. You've been nothing but a disruption since the day you were born. Your mother spoiled you, filled your head with ideas about being special, and now look at you buying houses you don't need just to hurt people who actually deserve them." "I deserve this house," I said, my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "I earned every dollar that paid for it, which is more than I can say for you." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I know about the debts, Dad, the gambling, the predatory loans, the fact that you've been trying to use Mother's estate as collateral for years. I know you're nearly $500,000 in debt to some very dangerous people." I watched the color drain from his face, watched shock replace rage for just a moment before defensive anger surged back. "You don't know anything," he spat. "You've been talking to lawyers spying on me that money should have been mine. Your mother had no right to lock it away from me. I was her husband." "You were her ex-husband," I said quietly. "She divorced you before she died. You hid the papers, but they exist. You had no legal right to anything she left, and you know it." The fury that crossed his face was so intense I actually took a step back. But before he could respond, I heard a car pulling up to the back of the property. Sandra and Melissa had arrived. My father heard it too. His head whipped toward the sound and he started moving in that direction. I intercepted him, positioning myself between him and the path to the back garden. "Get out of my way, Erica." "No. That's my daughter. I have every right." "You have no rights here." I interrupted, my voice hard. "This is my property. You're trespassing, and I'm not letting you near Melissa until we've had a very honest conversation about what you've been doing." I pulled out my phone and showed him some of the documents Margaret had given me, the communications with Richard Thornburg, the notes from the loan sharks about Melissa being a target, the evidence of his plan to essentially sell her off to cover his debts. With each revelation, I watched him search for an explanation, a defense, some way to spin this that would make him the victim or at least the misunderstood protagonist of his own story. But the evidence was too clear, too damning. "You tried to use her," I said, my voice shaking now with genuine emotion. "Your own daughter, not as a person you love and want to protect, but as a transaction, as a way to solve your financial problems." "You don't understand business," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Thornburg is a good man. He could give Melissa a stable life. There's nothing wrong with a father wanting his daughter to marry well." "She doesn't love him. She doesn't even know him. You were going to manipulate her into a relationship with a man old enough to be her father so he'd pay off your gambling debts." The back door opened, and Melissa appeared, Sandra close behind her. Melissa's face was tear-stained, her usual polished appearance disheveled. She'd clearly been crying for hours. When she saw our father, her expression crumpled further. "Dad," she said, her voice small and uncertain, "is it true what Erica's saying about Mr. Thornburg?" "About the debts." My father's face went through a rapid series of expressions: anger, calculation, something that might have been shame, and finally settling on defensive aggression. "Melissa, sweetheart, your sister has been filling your head with lies. She's trying to turn you against me because she's jealous. She's always been jealous of our relationship." "I saw the emails," Melissa interrupted, her voice stronger now. "Sandra showed me. You forwarded them to her by accident last week, remember, when you meant to send that recipe?" My father's eyes widened. The color that had drained from his face earlier rushed back as a deep, ugly red. "You had no right to read my private correspondence," he said, his voice rising. "Both of you sneaking around, spying, turning against me when all I've ever done is try to provide for this family." "Provide?" Melissa's voice cracked. "You're $500,000 in debt. You were going to make me marry someone for money." "It's not like that," my father insisted, moving toward her. "Richard is a good man. He could have taken care of you, given you the life you deserve. There's nothing wrong with selling me," Melissa shouted, and I'd never heard her voice like this, raw, angry hurt. "That's what you were doing, Dad, selling me to pay off your gambling debts." "Don't be dramatic," he snapped. "You're just like your mother, always overreacting, always making me the villain when I'm trying to do what's best for everyone." Melissa stepped forward, getting between me and my father. "Stop," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Stop lying. Stop manipulating. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not being your perfect daughter who does whatever you say and believes whatever story you tell." My father's expression shifted into something uglier than I'd ever seen. The mask he'd worn for so many years, the devoted father, the respected businessman, the pillar of the community, finally cracked completely. "You ungrateful little—" He raised his hand and I saw it happening as if in slow motion, saw his arm coming up, saw Melissa's eyes widen in shock, saw the moment when theoretical danger became actual violence. The slap connected with Melissa's cheek with a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet night. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face, her eyes wide with disbelief and pain. The silence that followed was absolute. Sandra gasped. I stood frozen, my mind trying to process what had just happened. And Melissa just stared at our father, this man she'd idolized her entire life, who had just shown her exactly who he really was when he didn't get his way. "Melissa." My father started, his voice already shifting to justification, to explanation, to making this her fault somehow. But she didn't let him finish. She turned and ran, not into the house, but toward the front driveway, toward the darkness beyond the property lights. Sandra called after her, but she didn't stop. I heard a car door slam and engine start. Melissa's car she must have driven separately from Sandra. The headlights swept across us as she pulled out of the driveway too fast, tires squealing slightly on the pavement. My phone buzzed a moment later. A text from a number I now recognized as Melissa's. "I need time. Don't look for me. Either of you." My father stood in my driveway, his hand still raised slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd done, and I looked at him with a clarity that felt almost transcendent. This was what he'd always been beneath the surface. This violence, this willingness to hurt anyone who didn't submit to his control. My mother had seen it. That's why she'd protected me so thoroughly. And now Melissa had finally seen it too. "Get off my property," I said quietly. "And don't ever come back." My father left without another word, climbing into his Mercedes, with movements that seemed decades older than they had an hour before. I watched his taillights disappear down the street, then turned to Sandra, who stood on my front steps looking shaken and uncertain. "Thank you for calling me," I said, "and for being there for Melissa." "I'm worried about her," Sandra admitted. "She's been not herself lately, even before tonight. I've known her since college, and I've never seen her like this." We exchanged phone numbers and promised to contact each other if either of us heard from Melissa. After Sandra left, I stood alone in my beautiful mansion, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. Melissa's text had been clear: she needed space, didn't want to be found. But the image of my father's hand connecting with her face kept replaying in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving her alone right now was dangerous. I started with her friends, the ones whose names I remembered from social media or overheard conversations. Most of them were polite but guarded when I called, clearly surprised to hear from me. A few were more forthcoming. "Melissa's been struggling," her friend Jessica told me when I finally got her on the phone late that night. "She puts on a good face, but those of us who really know her can see she's not okay. The pressure from your dad is intense. Nothing she does is ever good enough. She got a promotion at work 3 months ago, and instead of congratulating her, he asked why she wasn't director level yet." "I didn't know," I said quietly. "Why would you?" Jessica's voice wasn't accusatory, just factual. "Melissa never talks about you. I think it's easier for her to pretend you don't exist than to deal with whatever complicated stuff is there." Another friend, Marcus, was even more direct. "Your sister has an anxiety disorder," he told me bluntly. "She's been in therapy for 2 years, on medication for 1. Every achievement just raises the bar higher. Her therapist told her she's caught in a cycle where her self-worth is entirely dependent on external validation, primarily from your father. When she found out you bought that mansion, the one she wanted, it wasn't really about the house. It was about what it meant. That she wasn't the successful daughter after all. That the narrative she'd built her entire identity around was false." I spent the next 2 days following digital breadcrumbs. A credit card charge at a gas station 40 miles north. A friend who'd seen her car parked outside a grocery store in a town I'd never heard of. Finally, I got a lead from someone who'd spotted her at a small motel off the highway, the kind of place that charged by the night and didn't ask questions. I drove there on a gray Thursday afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The motel was exactly as depressing as I'd imagined: single-story U-shaped building, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign advertising vacancy. Melissa's car was parked outside room 114. I knocked softly on the door, half expecting her not to answer. But after a long moment, I heard movement inside, and then the door cracked open, secured by a chain lock. Melissa looked through the gap, and I barely recognized her. Her hair was unwashed, pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her face was bare of makeup, revealing dark circles under red-rimmed eyes. She was wearing sweatpants and an old college t-shirt I vaguely remembered seeing years ago. The contrast to her usual polished appearance was jarring. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Your friends are worried about you. They helped me track you down." I paused. "Can I come in, just to talk?" For a moment, I thought she'd refuse. Then she closed the door, and I heard the chain sliding free. When she opened it again, she stepped back to let me enter. The room was small and depressing, with brown carpeting and furniture that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. But what struck me more was the evidence of Melissa's state of mind: fast food wrappers scattered on the desk, clothes strewn across the floor, the bed unmade and clearly slept in for multiple nights. This wasn't just a temporary retreat. This was someone in crisis. Melissa sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders hunched. I sat in the room's single chair, giving her space. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. "For everything. For all the years of being awful to you. For laughing when Dad humiliated you. For acting like I was better than you when I'm not. I'm not better than anyone. I'm just broken." The word hung in the air between us. Broken. Not the polished, perfect golden child everyone saw, but someone fundamentally damaged by the same toxic system that had damaged me. "You're not broken," I said gently. "You're hurt. There's a difference." She laughed, but it came out as more of a sob. "Do you know what it's like to spend your entire life trying to be perfect? To have every single achievement met with, 'That's good, but you could do better'?" I got a 98 on a test in high school, and Dad asked about the 2 points I missed. I got into a good college, and he asked why it wasn't an Ivy League. I got promoted, and he wanted to know why I wasn't VP yet. Her hands were shaking as she spoke, words tumbling out like they'd been held back for years. And the worst part is, I became addicted to it, to chasing his approval. Even when I knew I'd never really get it, I kept trying. And I took it out on you because if I could be better than you, at least I was better than someone, right? At least I wasn't the complete failure he sometimes made me feel like. She looked at me, then really looked at me, her eyes swimming with tears. "And then you bought that mansion, with cash. And I realized you'd been successful this whole time, and you'd done it without Dad's help, without his money, without his approval. You just did it. And I've spent my whole life dependent on him for everything: my sense of self, my financial security, my understanding of my own worth. And I don't even know who I am without that." I moved from the chair to sit beside her on the bed. Up close, I could see she was trembling, not just her hands, but her whole body, like someone in shock. "The night Dad hit me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "it broke something. Not just my illusion of who he was, but my illusion of who I was. I thought I was the beloved daughter, the chosen one. But if that was true, he wouldn't have been willing to sell me off to pay his debts. He wouldn't have hit me when I disagreed with him. I was never actually loved. I was just useful. Until I wasn't." Melissa. And the scary part is, I don't know how to be anything else. My entire personality is built around pleasing him, impressing him, being what he wanted me to be. If I'm not that, then what am I? She was crying fully now, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from a place of profound grief. I put my arm around her shoulders, and she collapsed against me. This woman who'd been my tormentor and my father's favorite, now just a broken person who needed comfort. We sat like that for a long time, her crying and me holding her, both of us mourning different versions of the same lost childhood, the same absent father who'd damaged us both in his own particular ways. Finally, when her tears had subsided to occasional hiccups, she pulled back and wiped her face with her sleeve. "There's something else," she said, her voice small and frightened. "Something I haven't told anyone." "What is it?" She got up and went to the window, pulling back the curtains slightly to peek out at the parking lot. "There's a car that's been following me," she said. "Black sedan, 2 men inside. They were at the grocery store when I went yesterday. They were at the gas station this morning, and they're out there now, parked 3 spaces down from my car." My blood ran cold. I moved to the window and looked where she was pointing. Sure enough, there was a black sedan with tinted windows, 2 silhouettes visible in the front seats. "They want to collect Father's debt," Melissa said, her voice shaking. "And they think I'm the way to do it." I pulled out my phone immediately and called the police, giving them the motel address and describing the suspicious vehicle. The dispatcher assured me a patrol car would be there within 15 minutes. While we waited, I moved Melissa away from the window and started gathering her scattered belongings. "You're coming with me," I told her. "To the mansion, you'll be safe there. I have a security system, cameras, the whole setup." She nodded mutely, too exhausted and frightened to argue. We packed quickly, throwing her clothes haphazardly into her suitcase. By the time the police arrived, we were ready to leave. I explained the situation to the officers, that my sister was being harassed in connection with debts she didn't owe, and they promised to question the men in the sedan and run their plates. As we drove away in my car, Melissa's vehicle left behind for her to retrieve later with police escort, she stared out the window in silence. The breakdown I'd witnessed in the hotel room seemed to have left her hollowed out, fragile in a way I'd never seen her before. "I'm sorry," she said again as we merged onto the highway. "I keep saying it, but I don't think I can say it enough. I was so cruel to you, Erica, for so many years. And the worst part is I knew it was wrong. I knew you didn't deserve it. But I did it anyway because it made me feel less worthless." "You weren't cruel because you're a bad person," I said carefully. "You were cruel because you were trapped in a system that pitted us against each other. Dad needed you to be better than me so he could justify how he treated me. And you needed to believe you deserved his favoritism, because otherwise you'd have to face how conditional his love really was." She was quiet for a moment. "When did you get so wise?" "Therapy," I said. "Lots of therapy." We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when my phone rang. An unfamiliar number, but something made me answer it on the car's Bluetooth. "Erica." The voice was Linda's, my stepmother's, but I almost didn't recognize it. She sounded terrified, her words coming in rushed, breathless gasps. "Linda, what's wrong?" "I need to talk to you. Please. I know you have no reason to help me, but I'm begging you. This time, I can't stay silent anymore." Melissa sat up straighter in the passenger seat, her eyes wide. "What happened?" I asked. "Not over the phone. Can you meet me? There's a coffee shop on 5th and Morrison. I'm here now. Please, Erica. It's important." I looked at Melissa, who nodded slowly. "Okay," I told Linda. "We'll be there in 15 minutes. The coffee shop was nearly empty when we arrived, just a few students with laptops and an older couple sharing a newspaper. Linda sat in the back corner, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she clearly hadn't touched. When she looked up at us, I actually gasped. Her left eye was swollen, already turning purple. There was a cut on her lip, and the way she held herself suggested other injuries hidden beneath her coat. "Oh my God," Melissa whispered. Linda's eyes filled with tears when she saw her daughter. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." We sat down across from her, and she began to talk, words tumbling out between sobs. The previous night, my father had demanded she sign documents for another loan using the house as collateral this time. When she refused, he'd lost control completely. He'd broken down her bedroom door, she'd started locking it at night months ago, and attacked her. The injuries we could see were just the visible ones. "I went to the emergency room," she said, pulling out her phone to show us photos she'd taken of herself. The images were horrifying: bruises across her ribs, a handprint-shaped mark on her upper arm where he'd grabbed her. "But this isn't the first time." She showed us hospital records going back years. 5 separate emergency room visits, all documented as accidental injuries. Falls downstairs, tripping over furniture, walking into a door. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Every time I disagreed with him, every time I didn't do exactly what he wanted, there were consequences. Linda said, her voice breaking. I thought if I just kept Melissa happy, kept her successful, maybe he'd leave us alone. But it was never enough. Nothing was ever enough. Melissa reached across the table and took her mother's hand, tears streaming down her own face. Linda looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, genuine remorse. You think I hated you, Erica. You think I was cruel because I didn't like you. But I was terrified. Your mother was the only person who ever stood up to him, and she died. I convinced myself she died because of the cancer, but deep down I always wondered. And I was too scared to protect you, because I was barely protecting myself and Melissa. She pulled out a worn envelope from her purse with shaking hands. But I see now how strong you are. How you got away from him and built a life he couldn't touch. And I want that. I want to be free like you are. But more than that. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I have evidence. About what he did to your biological mother. Things I've kept hidden for 20 years because I was too afraid to speak up. The coffee shop seemed to recede around us. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. What kind of evidence? I asked. Linda's hand trembled as she held the envelope. I have evidence, she said again, meeting my eyes with an expression of desperate determination, about what he did to your biological mother. Linda slid the envelope across the table toward me, but before I could open it, Melissa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her face went white. It's from the bank, she said, her voice barely audible. Mom, did you see this email? Linda fumbled for her own phone, and I watched both their expressions shift from confusion to horror as they read whatever message had just arrived. What is it? I asked. Melissa turned her phone so I could see the screen. It was a formal notice from First National Bank regarding property at the address where Linda and Melissa lived. The house that had been the family home for over 20 years. Notice of default and intent to foreclose, I read aloud. Due to non-payment of mortgage obligations totaling $847,000 the property located at. I stopped looking up at Linda. You took out an $847,000 mortgage. No, Linda said, her voice shaking. I would never. The house has been paid off for 15 years. This has to be a mistake. But even as she said it, I could see in her eyes that she knew it wasn't a mistake. She knew exactly who was responsible. When did you sign the power of attorney? I asked gently. Linda's hand went to her mouth. 3 months ago? He said it was just for practical purposes in case something happened to him and I needed to access accounts or make medical decisions. I didn't think he used it to mortgage your house. I said, already pulling up the bank's information on my phone. A power of attorney for financial matters would give him the legal right to take out loans in your name using assets titled in your name as collateral. Melissa was scrolling through her email, now finding more messages that had apparently been going to a spam folder. There are notices here going back 6 weeks, she said, her voice rising with panic. Payment due notices. Warning letters. Mom, we're going to lose the house. Where are we supposed to go? I called Margaret Thornton, immediately explaining the situation while Linda and Melissa sat across from me in various states of shock and despair. Margaret asked me to forward all the documents, which I did, and promised to have someone from her firm look into it right away. While we waited for her callback, I studied the foreclosure notice more carefully, and something about the timeline began to bother me. The loan had been taken out 3 months ago, right around the time I'd started looking at real estate listings. The first payment had come due 6 weeks ago, right before the dinner where my father had humiliated me about never owning a house like Melissa. He knew I was looking at properties. I said slowly, piecing it together. He somehow found out I was financially successful and might buy a house. So he set this up. Set what up? Melissa asked. A trap. For me. I looked at Linda. He mortgaged your house knowing he'd never make the payments. He knew the bank would eventually foreclose. And when they did, you and Melissa would have nowhere to go. You'd be desperate. And who has a big new house with plenty of room? Understanding dawned on Linda's face, followed by a look of such profound betrayal that I almost felt sorry for her. He was going to make us homeless, she whispered. So we'd have to come to you begging for help, and then he'd have leverage over you again. He'd position himself as the reasonable father trying to help his struggling wife and daughter, I continued. And I'd be the cruel daughter who refused to help family in need unless I got something in return. Or if I did help, he'd be back in my life with access to my home, my resources. Either way, he wins back some control. Melissa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I'm going to be sick. She rushed toward the bathroom, leaving Linda and me alone. He doesn't love us, Linda said almost to herself. Any of us. We're just pieces on a board, tools he uses to get what he wants. My phone rang. Margaret. I've had my associate pull the mortgage documents, she said without preamble. It's legal technically. The power of attorney was properly executed and the bank followed all standard procedures. But there are aspects of this that could constitute fraud, particularly if we can prove he never intended to make payments and executed the loan specifically to create a hardship situation. Can we stop the foreclosure? Possibly. We'd need to file an emergency motion and we'd need Linda to officially revoke the power of attorney and potentially file a fraud claim against your father. It would be messy, public, and emotionally difficult. Or, I asked because I could hear in her voice that there was an alternative. Or you could pay off the mortgage. Stop the foreclosure immediately. I know that's a significant sum, but given your assets, it's feasible. Then you'd own the debt, and you could work out whatever arrangement you wanted with Linda and Melissa. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Do it. Pay it off. I'll transfer the funds this afternoon. Erica, Linda started, but I held up my hand. You and Melissa are coming to stay at the mansion, I said firmly. Both of you, tonight. This isn't negotiable, and we're getting lawyers, the best ones we can find, to protect all 3 of us from whatever he tries next. When Melissa returned from the bathroom, pale but composed, I explained the plan. Both she and Linda tried to argue to insist they couldn't accept such help, but I cut through their protests. This stopped being about family dynamics the moment he started committing fraud and putting you in danger, I said. This is about survival now, and we survive better together. That evening I watched as a car from Margaret's law firm parked discreetly down the street from my mansion. Not to threaten or intimidate, but to provide security surveillance. Inside, Linda and Melissa were settling into guest rooms, 2 women who'd spent years viewing me as competition or nuisance, now under my protection. My phone rang again. Margaret. I've been going through more of your father's financial records, she said, and I think we have grounds for a countersuit. Mortgage fraud, financial elder abuse. Linda's only 52, but the power of attorney manipulation might qualify. The question is, do you want to go on the offensive? I thought about my mother's envelope still unopened in my purse, about years of cruelty and control, about Melissa's face when our father hit her, about Linda's bruises and hospital records. Yes, I said. I want to countersue him for everything. Mortgage fraud, whatever else you can find. I want him to face consequences. Then that's what we'll do, Margaret said. Do you want to countersue your father for mortgage fraud? The answer had never been clearer. Absolutely. Over the next 3 days, I found myself transforming into something I'd never quite been before, a protector. Not just of myself, but of 2 women who had spent years either dismissing me or actively making my life harder. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I discovered that protection wasn't about who deserved it, it was about who needed it. I coordinated with Margaret's firm to establish legal safeguards for both Linda and Melissa. We filed restraining orders, set up separate bank accounts that my father couldn't access, and began the process of disentangling them from every financial connection to him. I walked Melissa through how to freeze her credit, how to monitor for identity theft, how to recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation. Linda, it turned out, had never had her own credit card. Everything had been in my father's name or joint accounts he controlled. "I don't know how you know all this," Melissa said one evening as we sat in my living room surrounded by legal documents and financial statements. "How to handle lawyers, protect assets, deal with all these systems. I feel like I should know this stuff at 32, but I don't." "You were never taught to be independent," I said gently. "You were taught to be taken care of. There's a difference." I watched something shift in her expression, a recognition that the life she'd thought was privilege had actually been a different kind of prison. She'd been given things, yes, but she'd never been given agency. And now, faced with having to build that agency from nothing in her 30s, she was struggling in ways that were painful to witness. But she was learning. Both she and Linda were learning. And I found unexpected satisfaction in teaching them and sharing the hard-won knowledge I'd gained from years of having to figure everything out alone. "Thank you," Melissa said suddenly one afternoon. We were in the kitchen, and she'd been quiet all morning processing everything that had happened. "I know I don't deserve your help. I know I was terrible to you for years, but you're helping us anyway, and I don't understand why." I set down the coffee I'd been making and looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw not the golden child who'd been weaponized against me, but a woman who was fundamentally reconsidering everything she'd believed about herself and her family. "Because this isn't about what anyone deserves," I said. "It's about breaking a cycle. Dad hurt all of us. If I hurt you back, if I let you suffer because you didn't protect me when we were younger, I'm just continuing what he started. And I refuse to let him win like that." Something in Melissa's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might cry again. But instead she just nodded, and I saw in her eyes a respect I'd never seen before. Not the dismissive tolerance she'd shown me at family dinners, but genuine regard for who I was and what I'd become. That night around 11, my phone rang. My father's number. I'd been expecting this call, though I'd thought it might come sooner. I answered, but didn't speak, just waited. "Erica." His voice was completely different from any time I'd heard it before. The authority was gone. The condescension was gone. What remained was raw fear. "Erica, they're coming for me. The people I owe money to. They know about the house, about the foreclosure failing. They know you paid it off. They think you have money and they're demanding I get it from you. You have to help me." I said nothing, just listened to him breathe on the other end of the line. "Please," he continued, and the words sounded foreign in his mouth, like a language he'd never learned to speak properly. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I haven't been the father you deserved. But I'm asking, I'm begging you, please, save me." The word hung in the air between us, save. As if salvation was something I could grant, something he could demand even now, even after everything. I thought about all the times I'd wanted him to save me from loneliness, from feeling invisible, from the pain of growing up unwanted in my own home. He never had. Not once. "Please," he said again into my silence. "Please, Erica, save me." "No," I said finally, my voice calm and clear. "I'm not going to save you, Dad. You need to save yourself." I heard him suck in a breath, shock rendering him momentarily speechless. He genuinely believed I would help him even now. "I'm coming over," he said, recovering quickly. "We need to talk about this face to face. You can't just abandon family, Erica. Your mother would be ashamed of you." He hung up before I could respond. I stared at my phone for a moment, then walked into the living room where Linda and Melissa were watching a movie. "He's coming here," I said. "We need to be prepared." 20 minutes later, headlights swept across the front windows. My father's car pulled into the driveway with aggressive speed, and I watched through the security camera feed as he got out and strode toward my front door. I opened it before he could knock, standing in the doorway in a way that made it clear he wasn't being invited inside. "Erica, we need to talk," he said, trying to push past me. "We can talk right here." His jaw clenched. "Fine. You have an obligation to help me. I'm your father. I raised you, put a roof over your head." "You did the legal minimum required of a parent," I interrupted. "And you did it resentfully. That doesn't create an obligation on my part to fund your gambling debts and bail you out of situations you created." "It's not that simple," he snapped. "These are dangerous people. If I don't pay them, they'll—" He stopped, seeming to realize that threats might not be the best approach. His expression shifted, becoming softer, more calculated. "Your mother would have wanted us to stay together as a family. She would have wanted you to help me in my time of need. You know she valued family above everything." The invocation of my mother's name, spoken by the man who had hidden her divorce papers and possibly worse, made something hot and sharp rise in my chest. "Don't you dare," I said quietly. "Don't you dare use her memory to manipulate me. You don't get to speak for what she would have wanted." Behind me, I heard footsteps. Melissa had come to the door, drawn by the sound of our voices. My father's eyes shifted to her, and his expression hardened. "Melissa, talk some sense into your sister," he demanded. "Tell her she can't just let me be destroyed by these people. Tell her that family helps family." Melissa stood next to me, and I felt her trembling. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "No, Dad. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not helping you manipulate Erica or anyone else." His face flushed dark red. "You ungrateful, after everything I've given you, this is how you repay me, by siding with her. If something happens to me, it's on you, Melissa. My blood will be on your hands." Melissa flinched at the words, but then she did something I didn't expect. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket, old-worn, the kind of diary teenage girls keep. "I need to show you something," she said to me, her voice shaking. She opened the diary to a page marked with a faded ribbon and handed it to me. The entry was dated from when Melissa was 14, written in younger, rounder handwriting. "I saw Dad yelling at Erica again today. She was crying in her room after. I wanted to tell her I'm sorry, that I see what he's doing isn't fair. But Dad pulled me aside last night and said if I ever take her side, if I ever make him look bad, he'll send me away. He'll stop paying for my school, my clothes, everything. I'll lose everything. I'm so sorry, Erica. I see it all. But I'm too scared to say anything. I'm a coward." I looked up at Melissa, tears blurring my vision. She'd known. All those years she'd known what was happening, and fear had kept her silent. My father saw what I was reading and lunged for the diary, but I stepped back. His face contorted with rage. "That's private property. You have no right." He grabbed for a decorative vase on the entry table and smashed it against the wall. Linda appeared behind us, gasping. "I will not be disrespected in this way," he shouted. "You'll both regret this. You'll regret choosing to stand with that fraud." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, speaking calmly to the dispatcher while my father continued his tirade. Within minutes, sirens approached, and he seemed to realize he'd gone too far. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "This isn't over," he said, then turned and practically ran to his car, speeding away before the police arrived. After giving statements to the officers and showing them the security footage, I went back inside to find Melissa and Linda sitting together on the couch holding hands. I was about to join them when I heard voices outside. My father had pulled over a few streets away, and through my phone's connection to the security company's monitoring service that covered a wider radius, I could hear him talking to someone. "She has money," he was saying. "Millions. Just need to get her signature on a few documents. Then we can access it all." I stood frozen in my entryway, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my father plot my destruction in real time. The security company's monitoring service had picked up his voice from where he'd pulled over just 2 blocks away, and the conversation was being recorded automatically. "The angle is that she's mentally unstable," my father was saying to someone, presumably the lawyer he'd mentioned. "She's made impulsive decisions, bought a mansion she doesn't need, isolated herself from family. Will claim she misappropriated funds from her mother's estate that should have gone to me as the surviving spouse. I have documents that can be adjusted to support that claim. Adjusted, meaning forged. My father was planning to create false evidence to sue me for money I'd legitimately inherited from my own mother. The voice on the other end was harder to hear, but I caught fragments: psychiatric evaluation, financial conservatorship, if we can prove incompetence. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could take control of my assets. It was audacious, malicious, and just plausible enough in the hands of an unscrupulous lawyer that it might actually pose a real threat. I kept listening until my father ended the call, then immediately forwarded the entire recording to Margaret Thornton. Then I walked into the living room where Melissa and Linda still sat, their faces drawn with stress. "We need to talk," I said. "All of us, now." I gathered them in the kitchen, the three of us sitting around the marble island that had probably cost more than my father's car. The symbolism wasn't lost on me: three women he'd tried to control or destroy sitting in a house he'd mocked me for planning our counterattack. I played them the recording. Watched Linda's face go white with fury. Watched Melissa's hands clench into fists. "He's going to try to have you declared incompetent," Linda said, her voice shaking. "After everything you've accomplished, after you've saved both of us from homelessness." "He's desperate," I said. "Desperate people do desperate things. But we're not going to let him win." I had already sent the recording to Margaret, but I knew this required more than just legal defense. This required offense. Strategic, coordinated offense. "I think it's time we stopped reacting to him and started acting," I said, looking at both women. "We have evidence of financial fraud, domestic violence, attempted manipulation of the court system. We have 3 witnesses willing to testify to his pattern of abuse. We have documentation going back years." Linda leaned forward, something fierce emerging in her expression that I'd never seen before. "He thinks we're weak," she said quietly. "He thinks because he scared us for so long, we'll always be scared. But he's wrong." "He's very wrong," I agreed, feeling a smile spread across my face. "Now we're going to show him exactly how strong the women he underestimated actually are." We spent the next 3 hours at that kitchen table building our case. Melissa provided her diary along with screenshots of threatening text messages from our father over the years. Linda had her hospital records, photographs of injuries, and most crucially that envelope she'd mentioned containing medical records and notes from my mother's doctors that suggested her illness had been exacerbated by stress and possible physical trauma. I contributed the financial documents Margaret had gathered, the recording of tonight's phone call, and security footage of my father's aggressive behavior at the mansion. "We're not just defending against his lawsuit," I said as we organized everything into clear categories. "We're going to file our own suit. Fraud, abuse, attempted extortion. We're going to expose everything he's done publicly in a way that ensures he can never manipulate anyone again." Melissa looked up from the timeline we were building. "This is going to destroy his reputation. Everything he's built, everyone he's fooled into thinking he's this respectable businessman, it's all going to come out." "Good," Linda said firmly. "Let it come out. Let everyone see who he really is." The next morning, I had an emergency meeting with Margaret and her entire litigation team. I brought Linda and Melissa with me. We spent 4 hours going through every piece of evidence, building an airtight case, not just for defense, but for a coordinated counterattack. Margaret sat back in her chair after we'd finished, a satisfied smile on her face. "This is one of the strongest cases I've seen in 20 years of practice," she said. "If he's foolish enough to actually file this lawsuit claiming you're incompetent, we're going to destroy him in court. And even if he doesn't, we have enough here to file our own suit that will bury him." She looked at each of us 3 women who had walked into her office united in purpose. "We'll take them to court," Margaret said with absolute confidence, "and they will lose spectacularly." My father made good on his threat faster than I expected. 3 weeks after our confrontation at the mansion, I was served with legal papers. The lawsuit was exactly as the recording had predicted. He was claiming I had misappropriated assets from my mother's estate that should have rightfully gone to him as her surviving spouse, and that my recent erratic behavior, including the impulsive purchase of an expensive mansion, demonstrated mental instability that warranted court intervention. The lawsuit made local news. The Fisher family had a reputation in our community. My father had cultivated an image over decades as a successful businessman, devoted family man, pillar of society. The narrative he spun for reporters was heartbreaking. A concerned father forced to take legal action against a troubled daughter who had stolen from the family and isolated herself from those who loved her. I watched neighbors I'd known since childhood whisper as I walked to my car. Received emails from distant relatives expressing concern about my situation. The court of public's opinion was initially sympathetic to my father because why wouldn't it be? He'd spent years building credibility while I'd been invisible, living my life quietly in the city. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. I arrived at the courthouse with Margaret dressed in a simple navy suit, my hair pulled back, no jewelry except my mother's wedding ring that I wore on my right hand. Margaret had coached me on courtroom demeanor, calm, dignified, responsive, but not reactive. My father arrived with his lawyer and Linda, who was playing her role perfectly, the concerned stepmother worried about her troubled stepdaughter. She'd covered her bruises with makeup. She looked elegant and sympathetic. The courtroom was more crowded than I'd expected. Neighbors, acquaintances, even some of my father's business associates had come to watch. I could feel their eyes on me, judging, assessing. My father's lawyer presented their case first. He painted a picture of a young woman who had always been troubled, difficult, alienated from her loving family. He presented documents doctored, I knew, but convincing, suggesting financial irregularities in how my mother's estate had been distributed. He called my purchase of the mansion impulsive and financially irresponsible, evidence of poor judgment. Then my father took the stand. He was masterful. His voice broke at just the right moments. He spoke about his worry for me, his desperate attempts to maintain a relationship despite my hostility. He claimed I'd shut out the family, refused help, made increasingly erratic decisions. "I'm not doing this for money," he said, looking directly at the judge. "I'm doing this because I love my daughter, and I'm terrified she's going to destroy herself. Someone needs to intervene before it's too late." Some people in the gallery nodded sympathetically. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my face calm. Then Linda took the stand. She testified that I'd always been jealous of Melissa, that I'd harbored resentment toward the family for years. She claimed, and this was particularly bold, that I'd once threatened her, saying I'd make the family pay for how they'd treated me. It was a complete fabrication, but she delivered it with such conviction that I saw several jurors leaning forward, believing her. Margaret didn't cross-examine aggressively. She asked a few pointed questions, but mostly let them speak. Let them commit to their narrative. Let them feel confident in their lies. When it was our turn, Margaret stood and approached the bench. "Your Honor, before we present our defense, I'd like to submit evidence that directly contradicts the testimony we've just heard." She nodded to her assistant, who set up a small speaker system. "This is an audio recording made 3 weeks ago, capturing a conversation between the plaintiff David Fisher and his attorney discussing this very lawsuit." The courtroom went silent as Margaret pressed play. My father's voice filled the room. "The angle is that she's mentally unstable. She's made impulsive decisions, bought a mansion she doesn't need, isolated herself from family. We'll claim she misappropriated funds from her mother's estate that should have gone to me as the surviving spouse. I have documents that can be adjusted to support that claim." The lawyer's response: "If we can prove incompetence, we can pursue financial conservatorship." The atmosphere in the courtroom transformed instantly. I watched color drain from my father's face. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. Several people in the gallery gasped. The recording continued for another minute, damning undeniable evidence that this entire lawsuit was a fabrication designed to steal my assets. When it ended, the silence was deafening. The judge's expression had gone from patient attention to barely controlled fury. She looked directly at my father. "Mr. Fisher," she said, her voice cold and precise, "please stand and explain the conversation we just heard." My father stood slowly, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "That recording was taken out of context," he said. I was speaking hypothetically, exploring legal options with my attorney. It's not what it sounds like." "Hypothetically adjusting documents," the judge asked her tone, making clear exactly what she thought of that explanation. "Please elaborate on what that means, Mr. Fisher." He stumbled through an explanation that made less sense with each word. He contradicted things he'd said in his earlier testimony. His lawyer tried to intervene, but the judge silenced him with a look. "Mr. Fisher, did you or did you not conspire to present false evidence to this court?" she asked directly. It's complicated. My daughter has turned everyone against me. She's poisoned my wife and stepdaughter against me. Please answer the question." The silence stretched. My father's face had gone from pale to flushed sweat visible on his forehead. Margaret stood. "Your Honor, if I may, I have additional evidence that speaks to Mr. Fisher's credibility and his legal standing to make any claim on his late wife's estate." The judge nodded, and Margaret's assistant brought forward a set of documents that I knew would change everything. "These are certified court records from this very courthouse," Margaret said, "documenting divorce proceedings between Catherine Fisher and David Fisher filed 22 years ago." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. My father's face went white. Margaret continued, her voice clear and authoritative. "The records show that Catherine Fisher filed for divorce 8 months before her death, citing domestic violence and infidelity. The court granted the divorce 2 months before Mrs. Fisher passed away from cancer. At the time of her death, David Fisher was no longer her legal spouse." She approached the bench and handed copies to the judge, then turned to address the courtroom. "This means that David Fisher had no legal right to inherit from Catherine Fisher's estate. Furthermore, we have evidence that Mr. Fisher deliberately hid these divorce documents and represented himself as the surviving spouse in order to claim assets that belonged solely to his ex-wife. He has been misappropriating estate funds for 22 years. The judge was reading through the documents, her expression growing grimmer. When she looked up, she addressed my father directly. "Mr. Fisher, were you aware that your divorce from Catherine Fisher had been finalized before her death?" My father opened his mouth, closed it. His lawyer was frantically flipping through papers, clearly blindsided. We were reconciling. The divorce was a mistake. She would have wanted—" "This is a yes or no question, Mr. Fisher. Were you aware the divorce had been finalized?" "Yes," he admitted finally, the word barely audible. "And you nevertheless claimed spousal inheritance rights." He said nothing. The judge's gaze could have cut glass. "Mr. Fisher, you have wasted this court's time with a lawsuit that was fraudulent from its inception. You had no standing to claim any inheritance from your ex-wife's estate, yet you've spent 2 decades accessing funds that belonged to your daughter." Margaret wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we have one more witness. Melissa Chen would like to testify about her father's behavior." I turned to see Melissa standing in the back of the courtroom. She looked terrified but determined as she made her way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, she sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Ms. Chen, how would you describe your relationship with your stepfather?" Margaret asked gently. "I thought he loved me," Melissa said, her voice shaking. "I thought I was special to him, but I realize now that he only valued me when I did exactly what he wanted. He controlled every aspect of my life through money and approval. When I tried to make my own decisions, he became angry. And when I stood up to him—" Her voice broke. "He hit me." She touched her cheek unconsciously where the bruise from that night had long since faded. "He never loved me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He only loved controlling me. And he did the same thing to Erica, just in different ways. He's been manipulating and using all of us for decades." The courtroom was absolutely silent. My father sat with his head in his hands. The judge set down her pen and looked at my father with an expression of complete disgust. "Mr. Fisher, this court finds your lawsuit to be entirely without merit and filed in bad faith. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented today, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office. You will face criminal charges for fraud, perjury, and misappropriation of estate funds." She turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "Ms. Fisher, I apologize that you've had to endure this proceeding. The court finds in your favor on all counts." Then she looked back at my father one final time. "Mr. Fisher, you will face criminal charges." The court's decision should have been the end of it. My father was facing criminal charges, his lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice, and his reputation in the community had been thoroughly destroyed. But I should have known that someone who'd spent decades manipulating and controlling wouldn't surrender quietly. 3 nights after the hearing, my security system alerted me to motion at the front door. It was nearly midnight. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone and saw my father's car in the driveway, but this time he wasn't pounding on the door or circling the house aggressively. He was kneeling on my front porch. I watched through the camera, stunned as he knelt there in the cold November night, his head bowed. After a moment, he looked up directly at the camera. He knew I was watching, and I saw his face was wet with tears. My phone rang. His number. "Erica," he said when I answered, his voice broken. "Please, just let me talk to you. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Against my better judgment, against every instinct that told me this was another manipulation, I opened the door. Melissa had heard the security alert and came to stand beside me, her hand finding mine. My father remained kneeling, which was so unlike him that it created a cognitive dissonance I couldn't quite process. "I've lost everything," he said, his voice raw. "My reputation, my business relationships, everything I spent my life building. And I deserve it. I know I deserve it." He looked up at me with what appeared to be genuine anguish. "But before I lose you forever, I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry, for all of it. For favoring Melissa, for dismissing you, for trying to use you both, for being a terrible father." The words I'd waited my entire life to hear spoken now, when they cost him nothing and could change nothing. "If you can find it in your heart to forgive me," he continued, "I'll do whatever you want. Divide the remaining assets fairly. Publicly admit my mistakes. Go to therapy. Whatever it takes to make this right." For a moment, just a brief, treacherous moment, I felt something in my chest soften. This was my father kneeling before me, seemingly broken and repentant. A small part of me that was still the child desperate for his love wanted to believe him. I saw Melissa glance at me, holding her breath, equally torn. "I don't expect you to decide right now," my father said, his voice gentle, almost pleading. "Just think about it. Please. Family is supposed to forgive family. Your mother would have wanted—" He stopped himself, seeming to realize invoking my mother was a mistake. I stood there, silent, stretching between us. And then I saw it, the briefest flicker in his eyes as he watched my face, calculating, assessing whether his performance was working. "Okay," I said slowly. "Stand up, Dad." He rose to his feet, hope flickering across his face. I watched as his posture began to shift, confidence creeping back in now that he thought he'd found the opening he needed. "But I need time to think about it," I continued. "This is a lot to process." His expression changed instantly, the mask of repentance sliding away so quickly it was almost comical. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched. "How much time?" he demanded, the gentle pleading tone completely gone. "Because I don't have time, Erica. Those people I owe money to, they're not going to wait while you process your feelings. I need your help now." "So this is about the money," I said flatly. "Not about making amends. About getting me to pay your debts." "Of course it's about the money," he exploded, all pretense abandoned. "What else would it be about? You have millions sitting in accounts while I'm being threatened by loan sharks. You're my daughter. You're supposed to help me. I'm not giving you a single dollar." I said, my voice cold and clear. His face transformed entirely, rage replacing the false remorse so completely that Melissa took a step back. "Then I'll make sure you regret this," he snarled. "I'll tell everyone the truth about you, that you're a selfish, vindictive woman who abandoned her family. I'll destroy whatever reputation you have left. I'll drag this whole family down to hell if you don't help me." "Now I finally see," I said quietly, feeling the last remnant of hope for him die in my chest. "You never loved me at all. You never loved any of us. You only loved controlling us." He grabbed a decorative plant stand from my porch and hurled it through one of my front windows. The glass shattered spectacularly. Melissa screamed. Linda appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the noise. "You ungrateful!" He started toward me and I stepped back into the house, already dialing 911. "I'm calling the police," I said calmly into the phone. "My father is destroying my property and threatening me." He picked up another object, a heavy outdoor lantern, and smashed it against the front door. The 911 operator was asking questions, but the security cameras were already recording everything. Within 7 minutes, police cars were pulling into my driveway, lights flashing. An officer approached me as 2 others restrained my father, who was still shouting threats about what he'd do to me. "We have everything on camera," I told the officer. "Property destruction, verbal threats, attempted assault." The officer reviewed the footage on my phone, then turned to me with a somber expression. "We need you to sign confirmation of the charges," he said, "and we'll arrest him." I signed the documents without hesitation. The police officers led my father to their patrol car, and I watched as he was placed in the back seat, still shouting incoherently about ungrateful daughters and family betrayal. The red and blue lights painted strange shadows across my mansion's facade as neighbors emerged from their homes to watch the spectacle. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded beyond that night's incident. The district attorney's office, armed with all the evidence Margaret had compiled, brought multiple charges: attempted fraud, perjury, forgery of legal documents, embezzlement from my mother's estate, and domestic violence based on Linda's hospital records and testimony. Each charge carried significant weight, and together they painted a portrait of a man who had spent decades breaking laws and hurting people. The community that had once respected David Fisher recoiled in collective horror as the truth emerged. The newspaper ran a series of articles detailing his financial crimes and abuse. Former business associates distanced themselves. People who had sat in that courtroom initially sympathetic to him now crossed the street to avoid being associated with him. I felt relief, certainly. The immediate threat was neutralized. But I also felt a deep sadness that surprised me with its intensity. This was still my father, still the man whose approval I'd once desperately craved. A part of me had always hoped that someday, somehow, he might change and become the father I deserved. His arrest meant accepting finally and irrevocably that would never happen. One evening, about 2 weeks after the arrest, Melissa found me in the mansion's library, staring out at the garden where fall leaves were gathering in copper-colored drifts. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly, sitting in the chair across from mine. "Of course." Did you know all along, not just about Dad's debts, but about how all of this would play out?" I was silent for a moment, considering how much to reveal. Then I realized that honesty was the only foundation we could build a real relationship on. "Not exactly all along," I admitted. "But I discovered Dad's financial situation about a year ago. I hired a private investigator when he started calling me more frequently asking for money. I thought if I understood what was happening, maybe I could help." Melissa leaned forward, listening intently. "The investigator found the gambling debts, the bad loans, all of it. At first, I genuinely considered paying everything off quietly just to keep the peace. But then he discovered something else. Dad was already planning to sue me to claim I'd stolen from Mom's estate. He was setting that up as a backup plan in case I refused to help him." I watched understanding dawn on Melissa's face. That's when I realized that if I bailed him out this time, he'd just come back. He'd always come back. The only way to be truly free was to let him destroy himself, to let everyone see who he really was. "The mansion," Melissa said slowly. "You knew it was the one I wanted." "I did. I'd seen your social media posts. And yes, buying it was partially strategic. I needed proof, undeniable, concrete proof that I was completely self-sufficient and successful without Dad's help. Something so big he couldn't dismiss it or explain it away. The house became that proof." "So you let everything play out," Melissa said. "You let him sue you, knowing you had evidence that would destroy his case." "I let him reveal his true nature in front of witnesses in official proceedings in ways that couldn't be denied or spun," I corrected. "I wasn't seeking revenge, Melissa. I was seeking freedom. For all of us." Melissa was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across and took my hand. "Thank you," she said, "for being strong enough to do what I couldn't, for protecting us even when we didn't deserve it." Linda appeared in the doorway then, and I could see she'd been crying. In her hands was a small wooden box. I recognized one of the items from my mother's belongings that Margaret had recently returned to us. "I need to show you both something," Linda said. "I should have given this to you years ago, Erica, but I was too afraid. It's time you had it." She set the box on the table between us and opened it. Inside were letters, photographs, and a sealed envelope with my name written in my mother's handwriting. "Your mother gave me this a week before she died," Linda said, her voice shaking. "She made me promise to give it to you when the time was right, when you were strong enough to handle what it contains." She handed me the envelope, and I felt the weight of my mother's words waiting inside messages from beyond the grave that would change everything I thought I understood. "An old letter," Linda said quietly, "addressed to you. From your mother. And Erica, there are things in there about your father that you need to know." I held the envelope for a long moment, afraid to open it. My mother's handwriting on the outside was so familiar it hurt. The same neat script that had written encouraging notes in my lunchbox when I was little, the same hand that had signed permission slips and birthday cards, and all the small documents of a childhood that felt impossibly distant now. "I'll give you privacy," Linda said, starting to stand, but I shook my head. "No, stay, both of you. Whatever this says, we should all hear it together." I broke the seal carefully as if the envelope itself were precious, and pulled out several handwritten pages on my mother's personal stationery. The date at the top was from 3 weeks before she died. "My dearest Erica," I read aloud, my voice already unsteady. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've grown into the remarkable woman I always knew you would become. I'm writing this from my hospital bed, watching you sleep in the chair beside me where you've spent so many nights, and my heart is breaking because I won't be there to see all the wonderful things you're going to accomplish." I had to pause, tears already blurring the words. Melissa moved closer, her hand resting on my shoulder. "I need you to know that every fear I had, every moment of doubt about leaving you alone in this world, was tempered by absolute certainty that you are strong enough to survive anything. You got that strength from me, but you've made it your own in ways that make me so proud, I can barely contain it." The next paragraph was about forgiveness, and I read it slowly, letting each word sink in. "I want to tell you something important about forgiveness, my love. Forgiveness is not about excusing people who've hurt you or pretending damage didn't occur. It's about releasing yourself from the weight of carrying their wrongs. Forgive yourself first for not being perfect, for not being able to fix everything, for being human and flawed and doing the best you could. Forgive yourself for the times you'll feel you should have been stronger or smarter or braver. You are enough exactly as you are." Melissa was crying now too, and even Linda had tears streaming down her face. "I know your father will not be kind to you after I'm gone." The letter continued, and my voice caught on those words. "I know this because he has not been kind to me, and without me here to shield you, you'll bear the full weight of his dysfunction. I wish I could protect you from that, but the best I can do is prepare you to protect yourself." I turned to the next page, and the tone of the letter shifted. My mother's handwriting became slightly more hurried, as if she'd been writing quickly, urgently, needing to get these words out. "There's something you need to know about why I'm dying, Erica. The doctors say it's cancer, and it is, But my illness progressed much faster than it should have, and I know why. Your father has been violent with me for years. Not constantly, not in ways that left obvious marks most of the time, but regularly enough that my body never fully healed from one incident before the next occurred. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the letter tighter, my hands shaking. Each time I was injured, he would force me to lie about what happened. I fell down the stairs. I walked into a door. I tripped over furniture. The family doctor, Dr. Patterson. Do you remember him suspected the truth? He asked me privately several times if I was safe at home, but he didn't have enough evidence to intervene, and I was too afraid to tell him the truth. Linda made a sound like a sob. I knew, she whispered. God help me, I suspected, but I convinced myself I was imagining things. I kept reading my mother's words pouring out across the years. I wanted to call the police so many times, Erica. I wanted to leave to take you somewhere safe. But this was 2003 and domestic violence laws were weak. I tried once early in our marriage to report your father for hurting me. The police officers who came to our house barely wrote anything down. They said it was a marital matter and suggested we see a counselor. Your father was charming and apologetic in front of them, and after they left, he made it very clear what would happen if I ever tried that again. My voice was barely above a whisper now as I continued. I was afraid that if I reported him, and it didn't work if they didn't arrest him if he got away with it, he would retaliate. And I was terrified of what he might do to you. You were so small, so vulnerable, I couldn't risk it. So I stayed and I endured, and I told myself I was protecting you by keeping the peace. The next paragraph explained what I already knew but had never fully understood. That's why I created the trusts, the protected assets, all the legal structures that will ensure you have resources he can never touch. I chose another way to protect you, not by fighting him directly, which I couldn't win, but by building you a fortress of financial independence that would activate after I was gone. I knew that one day you would be strong enough to protect yourself in ways I never could. And today, if you're reading this, you have done exactly that. I had to stop reading for a moment, the weight of what my mother had sacrificed overwhelming me. She'd stayed in an abusive marriage, endured years of violence, all because she believed it was the only way to keep me safe. The cancer is real, the letter went on. But it's spreading faster than it should because my body has been weakened by years of trauma. The doctors don't know this. They see only the disease, not the context. But I know. And I need you to know too. Not so you'll feel guilty or responsible, but so you'll understand why I made the choices I did. Everything I did was to give you a chance at a life I couldn't have. A life where you're free and safe and beholden to no one. The letter concluded with words that broke me completely. Live beautifully, my darling girl. Live freely. Don't waste time trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it. Find people who see you for who you really are and cherish you for it. Build a life so full of joy and purpose that my absence becomes just one small shadow in a landscape of light. I will always be with you, always proud of you, always loving you beyond measure. You are my greatest achievement, Erica, not in what you accomplish or achieve, but simply in who you are. I love you, always, Mom. I clutched the letter to my chest and sobbed great wrenching cries that came from a place so deep I hadn't known it existed. Melissa wrapped her arms around me and Linda did too, the three of us holding each other while I mourned the mother who had loved me enough to sacrifice everything, who had seen far enough into the future to save me even after she was gone. When I finally composed myself enough to speak, I looked at Linda. Did you know about the abuse while she was alive? Linda nodded, shame written across her face. I suspected. I saw bruises, sometimes heard things. But I was a coward, Erica. I told myself it wasn't my business, that maybe I was wrong. And then when your father and I got together after she died, I convinced myself he'd changed. That whatever had happened before was in the past. Until it happened to you, I said quietly. Until it happened to me, she confirmed. And I finally understood what your mother had lived through, what she'd endured to protect you. My phone rang. Margaret Thornton. I answered, my voice still thick with tears. Erica, I hope this isn't a bad time, but I've been doing some research into your mother's medical history, following up on some things Linda mentioned. I tracked down Dr. Patterson. He's retired now, but he still has records from that time period. He says he documented his suspicions about domestic violence in your mother's file, even though she never confirmed it. Those medical records could be used as evidence if we wanted to pursue additional charges against your father. I looked down at my mother's letter, at her careful handwriting, spelling out a truth she'd been too afraid to speak aloud while she was alive. The doctor from that time still has medical records, I said slowly, that could be used as evidence. We decided not to pursue additional charges related to my mother's death. Margaret explained that proving a direct connection between the abuse and her cancer's progression would be difficult, and more importantly, I realized my mother wouldn't have wanted me to spend years mired in legal battles. She'd wanted me to be free, and dragging myself through more courtroom proceedings felt like the opposite of freedom. Instead, I chose to honor her memory differently. The mansion, which had started as a symbol of independence and a subtle act of reclamation, became something much more meaningful. Melissa and I spent weeks transforming it together, choosing paint colors and furniture, debating artwork and window treatments. On the surface, we were decorating a house, but what we were really doing was rebuilding a relationship that had been twisted and damaged by years of manipulation. I always envied you, Melissa admitted one Saturday afternoon as we painted what would become her temporary bedroom. She'd decided to stay with me for a few months while she figured out her next steps. Even when Dad was showering me with attention and money, I envied the fact that you seemed free. You left and built a life he couldn't touch. I was too scared to do that. You weren't scared, I said carefully, edging around the window trim. You were trapped in a different kind of cage. Mine had bars I could see, so I knew I needed to escape. Yours was gilded and comfortable, so you didn't realize you were imprisoned until it was almost too late. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of brushes against wall, oddly meditative. What are you going to do with all your money? Melissa asked eventually. I mean, you have the mansion, but you still have millions left, right? I'd been thinking about that a lot, actually. The money my mother had left me, combined with what I'd earned from my software sale and investments, meant I had resources beyond what I could possibly spend on myself. And I kept thinking about her letter about how she'd chosen to protect me through financial independence because other avenues had been closed to her. I'm going to start a foundation, I said, for women who've been dismissed or underestimated by their families, women who need seed funding to start businesses or scholarships to go to college, or just support to believe they can build lives independent of families that don't value them. Melissa stopped painting and looked at me. That's perfect. Mom would love that. I'm calling it the Catherine Fisher Foundation for Women's Independence, I said, and I want you to help me run it if you're interested. Her eyes filled with tears. Really? You'd trust me with that? You understand what it's like to be controlled through money and approval, I said. That makes you perfect for helping other women recognize the same patterns. You can be the person you wish someone had been for you. Over the next few months, as fall turned to winter, the foundation took shape. We rented office space, hired staff, created application processes for grants and scholarships. Linda, who was going through her own divorce from my father, joined us part-time, using her experience to help develop resources for women leaving abusive marriages. The work was fulfilling in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each woman we helped felt like a small victory against the forces that had tried to diminish me, diminish my mother, diminish all of us. One December afternoon, Margaret called with news about my mother's estate. The final accounting was complete, and there was one more asset no one had known about: a small house in the town where my mother had grown up about 2 hours away. It's a modest property, Margaret explained. Your mother inherited it from her parents and kept it all these years but never mentioned it to your father. According to her will, it goes to you. It's probably worth about $200,000, not much, compared to your other assets, but it has sentimental value. Your mother wrote a note that she spent the happiest years of her childhood there. I drove out to see it the following weekend, and Melissa came with me. The house was small but charming, a 1920s bungalow with a front porch and a backyard that backed onto woods. Inside, it was furnished simply, clearly maintained by a property management company over the years, but not lived in. Walking through the rooms, I could almost feel my mother's presence, her childhood, her happiness before she married my father, before everything became complicated and painful. "It's lovely," Melissa said, running her hand along the kitchen counter. "Are you going to sell it?" I looked at my sister, this woman who had been both my tormentor and my fellow victim, who was now trying to rebuild her life from scratch at 32, with no safety net except what I provided. "No," I said slowly. "I'm going to give it to you." Melissa's head snapped up. "What, Erica? No. You don't need to. I want to," I interrupted. "You need a place that's yours, Melissa. Not Dad's house where you felt controlled. Not my mansion where you're a guest. Your own place where you can figure out who you are without anyone's expectations or judgments." "But this was Mom's," Melissa protested. "It should stay with you." "Mom would want you to have it," I said firmly. "This house represents her happy childhood before trauma and abuse. She'd want you to have that same chance to start over in a place associated with happiness and safety." Melissa started crying, and I pulled her into a hug. "You deserve a place where you feel loved," I said. "This house is where Mother was happy. Now it's your turn." We spent the rest of the day exploring the house and the small town, imagining Melissa's life there. She could keep working with the foundation remotely, build a community, maybe even find out who she was when she wasn't performing for anyone. Driving back to the mansion that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but a deep, settled sense that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The mansion no longer felt like a trophy or a proof of concept. It felt like home. The foundation felt like purpose. My relationship with Melissa felt like family, real family built on honesty and mutual support rather than manipulation and favoritism. I'd stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. I'd stopped carrying the weight of my father's expectations or the burden of his cruelty. I was just living, and it was enough. The invitation arrived on a cold January morning, delivered by courier. It was from Margaret's office, formal and official. "Please return to the family residence at address to receive final estate documents and personal effects of Catherine Fisher. Tuesday, January 14th, soon 0 p.m." I stared at the invitation, wondering what could possibly be left. We'd settled the estate, distributed the assets, closed every legal loop. What final documents could there be? But something in my chest told me this was important. That my mother had one more gift waiting for me in the house where she'd lived and suffered and ultimately died. "Return to the old family home," I read aloud to Melissa, who was making coffee in my kitchen, "to receive final documents." She looked up, her expression as curious as I felt. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked. I thought about it, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I do." Whatever my mother had left behind, whatever final message awaited me in that house, I didn't want to face it alone anymore. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Melissa and I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the familiar facade, the home where I'd grown up, where my mother had died, where so many painful memories lived in every corner. The new owners had repainted it a soft gray instead of the beige I remembered, but otherwise it looked unchanged. "Are you ready?" Melissa asked gently. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was. Margaret met us at the door with a key. The current owners had graciously agreed to let us access the attic where they'd found a sealed wooden box during renovations, clearly labeled with my name in my mother's handwriting. We climbed the narrow attic stairs, and Margaret handed me a flashlight. There, in the far corner beneath the eaves, where my mother must have hidden it years ago, was a cedar box I'd never seen before. I carried it down to the empty living room, my hands shaking slightly. Melissa sat beside me on the floor as I opened it. On top was an envelope with a single sentence written on the outside: "If you're reading this, you've saved yourself." Beneath the envelope were dozens of pages stories my mother had written about me. Memories of my childhood that she'd documented in careful detail. My first day of school where I'd been nervous but brave. A science fair project where I'd stayed up late perfecting my presentation. A piano recital where I'd played beautifully despite my terror. Each memory was accompanied by her reflections on my character, my strength, my potential. "She saw me," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "She really saw me." At the bottom of the box was a photograph I'd never known existed. My mother and me, maybe when I was 7 or 8, sitting in her garden. We were both laughing at something outside the frame, pure joy captured in that single moment. The sun was setting behind us, creating a halo of golden light. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, "My Erica, the light of my life. If you're reading this, you've saved yourself. I'm so proud of you." I held the photograph against my chest and cried, not from pain this time, but from a profound sense of being loved, of being seen and valued by the one person whose opinion had ever truly mattered. Melissa wrapped her arms around me, and we sat there on the floor of my childhood home, surrounded by evidence of a mother's love that had transcended death, that had planned and protected and guided me even from beyond the grave. "She knew," I said finally. "She knew I'd be strong enough to get away from him. She believed in me when no one else did." "She was right," Melissa said quietly. "Look at everything you've built, everything you've become." I looked around the empty room, and instead of seeing painful memories, I saw the journey. Every moment of being overlooked had taught me self-reliance. Every instance of being dismissed had taught me to value my own judgment. Every year of being underestimated had taught me that other people's opinions were not the measure of my worth. My mother had given me the tools I needed: financial independence, legal protection, and most importantly, the absolute certainty that I was loved and valued. What I'd built from those tools was mine, earned through intelligence and determination, and refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose on me. Standing in that house where I'd once felt so small and invisible, I realized I'd become exactly who my mother had believed I could be. Not because I'd proven my father wrong, his opinion was irrelevant now, but because I'd lived up to the faith my mother had placed in me. 1 year later, I stood on a stage in a hotel ballroom looking out at an audience of young women whose lives were about to change. The Catherine Fisher Foundation's first annual scholarship ceremony was awarding 50 full scholarships to women from difficult family situations. Women who'd been dismissed, underestimated, told they'd never amount to anything. I saw my own past reflected in their faces and felt my mother's legacy flowing through everything we'd built. In the front row, Melissa sat beaming with pride, now the foundation's director of outreach. Beside her sat Linda, who'd become our domestic violence program coordinator. Both women had transformed their pain into purpose, their suffering into strength that helped others. My father was conspicuously absent. He was serving year 2 of a 15-year sentence for fraud, embezzlement, and domestic violence. I'd visited him once early in his incarceration to tell him I forgave him, not for his sake, but for mine. He'd tried to manipulate me even then, but his words had no power anymore. I'd walked away free. As I began my speech welcoming the scholarship recipients to a new chapter of their lives, I felt my mother's presence so strongly it was almost physical. This was what she'd wanted. Not revenge, not proving people wrong, but freedom and the power to help others find their own freedom. My mother once told me that the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the freedom to become who we truly are. I told the audience, not who our families want us to be, not who society expects, but who we know ourselves to be in our quietest, truest moments. I looked at the 50 young women about to receive opportunities that would change their lives, just as my mother's planning had changed mine. "This time," I whispered so quietly, only I could hear, knowing somehow my mother heard too. I choose myself. The audience applauded, and I smiled, gazing out at the sea of women laughing and crying and celebrating their futures. I had completed my mother's legacy, but more than that, I had claimed my own. I was finally, completely, triumphantly free. And that's where Erica's story ends, or perhaps where it truly begins. From the forgotten daughter who sat silently through family dinners, enduring mockery and dismissal, she transformed into a woman who not only claimed her own power, but used it to lift up others who'd walked similar paths. Her father thought he could control her forever, thought money and manipulation would keep her small. He was wrong. This story reminds us of something crucial. The people who underestimate you don't define your worth. Erica's father spent decades trying to convince her she was less than that, she'd never measure up to her sister, that her dreams were too big for someone like her. But his words were lies built on his own insecurity and greed. The truth was in her mother's letters, in her own accomplishments, in the mansion she bought with money she earned, in the foundation that now changes lives. What makes Erica's revenge so satisfying isn't that she destroyed her father, though he certainly destroyed himself. It's that she refused to let his toxicity poison her own heart. She could have abandoned Melissa and Linda when they needed help. She could have walked away and let them suffer the consequences of enabling her father for so many years. But she chose compassion over cruelty, protection over revenge. That's real strength. If you've ever been the invisible child in your family, if you've ever been compared unfavorably to a sibling, if you've ever been told you'll never succeed, Erica's story is for you. It's proof that the narratives other people write about us don't have to become our reality. We can write our own endings. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have believed in you? How did you prove them wrong, or are you still on that journey? Drop your story in the comments below. This community is full of people who understand what it's like to fight for recognition and respect. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If Erica's journey resonated with you, if you found yourself cheering for her victory and moved by her mother's love, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is dedicated to stories of people who were counted out, but refused to stay down, who faced injustice and chose to rise above it with dignity and strength. We share these stories because they matter, because they remind us what's possible when we refuse to accept other people's limitations. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and becoming the person you were always meant to be. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than the people who tried to diminish them. And here's my question for you. If you were in Erica's position, would you have helped Melissa and Linda after the years of mistreatment, or would you have let them face the consequences alone? There's no wrong answer. I'm genuinely curious how you'd handle that situation. Let's discuss it in the comments. Thank you for listening to Erica's story. Thank you for being part of a community that believes in justice, resilience, and the power of women who refuse to be broken. Remember, you are not defined by the people who failed to see your worth. You are defined by what you build when you finally see it yourself. Until next time, keep choosing yourself. You deserve it.